I need you to father my child." The words hung in the air like a death sentence wrapped in silk. Daniel Okoro stood frozen in Catherine Hale's penthouse office, his janitor's uniform still damp with cleaning solution, while the woman who controlled billions watched him with eyes that had never learned to beg. No preamble, no mercy. Just an offer that would either save him or destroy everything he thought he knew about survival. Outside those floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled beneath them like a kingdom, her kingdom, and somehow, impossibly, she wanted something from him that money couldn't buy. Before we dive into what happened next, I invite you to follow this story to the very end. Like this video and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled. Now, let me tell you how a man with nothing became the center of a billionaire's most dangerous gamble. The fluorescent lights in the basement service corridor of Hale Industries flickered with their usual arrhythmic pulse, casting shadows that danced across Daniel Okoro's weathered hands as he pushed his cleaning cart toward the freight elevator. It was 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before his shift officially ended, and his lower back throbbed with the familiar ache that came from 6 hours of scrubbing floors that would be dirty again by noon. The wheels of his cart squeaked in protest, one of them perpetually misaligned no matter how many times he tried to fix it, a small frustration in a life built from small frustrations. At 32, Daniel had become intimately familiar with invisibility. He moved through the gleaming corridors of one of the world's most powerful corporations like a ghost, present but unseen, necessary but unacknowledged. Executives rushed past him without a glance, their $1,000 shoes clicking against floors he'd polished to mirror brightness. Security guards nodded at him with the casual recognition reserved for furniture that happened to move. Even the other cleaning staff barely spoke to him anymore, as if poverty were contagious and his particular strain especially virulent. His phone buzzed in his pocket, the fourth time in an hour. He didn't need to check it to know what the messages said. Medical bills from St. Catherine's Hospital, where his 15-year-old brother Marcus lay recovering from an asthma attack that had nearly killed him 3 weeks ago. Overdue rent notices from a landlord who'd stopped pretending to care about their circumstances. Collection agencies with their automated voices and barely veiled threats. The modern symphony of being broke in America, each notification another instrument joining the orchestra of desperation. Daniel had stopped opening the messages 2 days ago. Knowing the exact dollar amounts changed nothing when you had $17.38 in your checking account and 3 more days until payday. The freight elevator doors opened with a mechanical groan, revealing the same scratched metal interior he'd seen 1,000 times before. He wheeled his cart inside, pressed the button for the ground floor, and allowed himself the luxury of closing his eyes for the 40-second descent. In that brief darkness, he calculated again, as he'd calculated every morning for 3 weeks. Even with his paycheck, $438 after taxes, he'd still be short $2,847 for Marcus's medical bills, short $1,200 for rent, short of everything that mattered. The math never changed, no matter how many times he rearranged the numbers in his head. The elevator lurched to a stop, but not at the ground floor. Daniel's eyes snapped open. The display panel showed 47, the executive floor, the domain of corner offices and decisions that moved markets. He'd cleaned that floor exactly 3 times in his 2 years at Hale Industries, always under the supervision of senior staff, always with strict instructions about what he could and couldn't touch. The doors slid open, revealing not the usual empty corridor, but a woman he recognized instantly, though he'd never been closer to her than 100 feet. Catherine Hale stood alone in the hallway, her presence somehow filling the space like a physical force. She wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Daniel made in 6 months, her dark hair pulled back in a style that suggested both elegance and efficiency. At 46, she possessed the kind of beauty that money could enhance but not create. Sharp cheekbones, alert gray eyes that missed nothing, a posture that spoke of decades spent commanding rooms full of men who'd underestimated her exactly once. "Mr. Okoro," she said, her voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who'd spent the night working instead of sleeping. "Step out, please. Leave the cart." Daniel's first instinct was to check if he'd made some mistake, violated some protocol he didn't know existed. His second instinct was to wonder how she knew his name. In 2 years, he'd never spoken to anyone above a floor supervisor. He certainly hadn't imagined that Catherine Hale, the woman whose face appeared on the covers of Forbes and Fortune, whose decisions affected thousands of employees across 4 continents, would know the name of one janitor among hundreds. "Ma'am," he managed, his accent, Lagos filtered through 15 years in America, suddenly more pronounced in his nervousness. "Now, Mr. Okoro." Not unkind, but absolutely certain of being obeyed. He stepped out of the elevator and Catherine moved past him to press a button that sent the cart descending without him. The doors closed, sealing away his only excuse to leave. "Follow me," she said, already walking down the corridor toward the corner office at the end. She didn't look back to see if he complied. People like Catherine Hale didn't need to check if their instructions were being followed. Daniel walked behind her, his work boots silent on carpet so thick it felt like walking on moss. The hallway walls were decorated with abstract art that he suspected cost more than his entire apartment building, interspersed with photographs of Catherine shaking hands with presidents, tech moguls, and celebrities whose faces he recognized from magazine covers and grocery store checkout lines. This was a world so far removed from his own that it felt less like a different floor and more like a different planet. Catherine's office occupied the entire corner of the building, with floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides offering a view of the city as it awakened to morning. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of amber and rose, casting long shadows across a space that seemed designed to intimidate. A desk of dark wood and chrome dominated one end, while a seating area of leather furniture occupied the other. Everything was arranged with the kind of precision that suggested a mind that controlled chaos for a living. She gestured to one of the chairs facing her desk. "Sit." Daniel sat, perching on the edge of the seat like a man ready to bolt. His hands, calloused and marked with small scars from years of manual labor, looked out of place against the armrests. Catherine didn't sit immediately. Instead, she moved to the windows, standing with her back to him, silhouetted against the growing light. For a long moment, she said nothing, and Daniel wondered if this was some kind of test, if he was supposed to speak first or wait in silence. He chose silence. When she finally turned, her face was unreadable, composed in a way that suggested years of practice hiding whatever she actually felt. "I'm going to make you an offer, Mr. Okoro," she said, moving to her desk and opening a drawer. She removed a manila folder, placed it on the desk between them, but didn't open it. "An offer that will strike you as unusual, possibly unethical, certainly unconventional." Daniel's heart rate accelerated. Every instinct screamed that he should leave, that whatever was in that folder represented trouble he couldn't afford. But he didn't move. "I've had you investigated," Catherine continued, her tone as matter-of-fact as if she were discussing quarterly earnings. "Thoroughly. I know about your brother Marcus. I know about the medical bills. I know you're 3 weeks behind on rent and that your landlord has already filed eviction paperwork. I know you send money to your mother in Lagos every month, even when you don't have enough for groceries. I know you've applied for 17 better-paying positions in the last year and been rejected from all of them. I know exactly how desperate you are." The words should have angered him, but Daniel was too shocked to feel anything beyond a growing sense of surreality. He'd become so accustomed to being invisible that the idea of someone, especially someone like Catherine Hale, paying enough attention to know the details of his life, felt more impossible than insulting. "Why?" he managed. "Because I need something from you," Catherine said. She sat down now, folding her hands on the desk with the careful control of someone who'd mastered the art of negotiation through sheer force of will. "Something specific. Something that requires discretion, trust, and desperation in equal measure. You possess all 3 qualities." She opened the folder, turning it so Daniel could see the contents. The top page showed an official-looking document with government seals and dense legal text. His eyes caught familiar words: permanent residency, approved, immediate processing. "That's a green card application," Catherine said. "Already approved, fast-tracked through channels that most people don't know exist. It's yours, Mr. Okoro, permanent legal status in this country. No more work permit renewals, no more fear of deportation, no more uncertainty about your future or your brother's future." Daniel stared at the document, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. A green card. the thing he'd been trying to obtain through legal channels for 8 years, spending money he didn't have on lawyers who promised results and delivered nothing, the foundation upon which he could build an actual life instead of just surviving day to day. "Why would you give me this?" The question came out hoarse. Catherine's expression didn't change. "I'm not giving you anything, Mr. Okoro. I'm making an exchange. The green card plus $1 million, plus coverage of all your brother's medical expenses, and a trust fund that will pay for his education through graduate school if he chooses." The numbers didn't compute. Daniel's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "In exchange for what?" Catherine held his gaze, and in that moment he saw something flicker behind her composed exterior, not uncertainty exactly, but perhaps the acknowledgement that she was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "I want you to father my child." The words landed like a physical blow. Daniel felt the air leave his lungs, felt the room tilt slightly around him. He must have heard wrong. He must have misunderstood. "I need a biological child," Catherine continued, her voice steady, clinical almost, as if she were outlining a business proposal. "I'm 46 years old. My fertility is declining but not yet gone. I've exhausted the conventional options: sperm banks, donors with documented genetic profiles, the entire medical industrial complex designed for women in my position. Every option involves too many people, too much documentation, too many potential complications. I need something simpler and infinitely more discreet." Daniel couldn't speak. His mind spun through possibilities, trying to find the angle, the trap, the hidden camera that would reveal this as some elaborate prank. "I don't want a relationship," Catherine said. "I don't want a husband or a co-parent or someone who will make claims on my time, my company, or my life. I want a child with strong genetics, and I want absolute control over the narrative. No one can know who the father is. Ever." She stood, moving to the windows again, as if the conversation were easier if she wasn't looking at him directly. "I chose you for specific reasons, Mr. Okoro. You're healthy. Your employment physical showed no genetic red flags, no hereditary diseases, excellent cardiovascular health despite your economic stress. You're intelligent. I accessed your academic records from Lagos. Your scholarship to university before your father's death forced you to drop out and come to America. You're resilient. Surviving for 2 years on poverty wages while supporting your brother and sending money home demonstrates the kind of strength I want in my child's genetic makeup." She turned back to face him. "Most importantly, you're desperate. Desperate enough to agree to my terms. Desperate enough to keep a secret that could destroy both of us if it ever came to light." Daniel found his voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. "This is insane." "Yes," Catherine agreed, "it is. But insanity and innovation are often indistinguishable until after the fact. I'm offering you a way out of poverty, Mr. Okoro. Permanent legal status, financial security, your brother's future secured, all for approximately 6 to 8 weeks of your time, absolute discretion, and genetic material you were born with. By any rational calculation, it's an extraordinary deal." "And after?" Daniel asked. "After the child is born?" "You disappear," Catherine said simply. "The green card allows you to live and work anywhere in the United States. I'll provide you with a settlement sufficient to start a new life wherever you choose. You sign documents, ironclad, legally unassailable documents, relinquishing all parental rights and agreeing to never make contact with the child or claim any connection to it. As far as the world is concerned, you never existed." She moved back to the desk, pulled out another document from the folder. "I've had my lawyers draft a preliminary agreement. It covers every contingency, every possible scenario. You'll have your own legal representation, I'll pay for it, to ensure you understand exactly what you're agreeing to. But I need an answer in principle now, this morning, before you leave this office. Will you consider this arrangement?" Daniel looked down at his hands, those same hands that had scrubbed toilets and mopped floors and emptied trash cans for 2 years. He thought about Marcus, lying in a hospital bed, struggling to breathe. He thought about the eviction notice, the collection calls, the endless treadmill of poverty that kept spinning no matter how hard he worked. He thought about the green card, that simple piece of documentation that represented the difference between existing and living. "You said 6 to 8 weeks, he said finally. "What exactly would that involve?" Catherine's expression remained neutral, but he caught something in her eyes. Perhaps respect for asking the practical question instead of the moral one. You would live here, she said, in a private wing of my home. Full medical supervision to ensure optimal conditions for conception. It's a clinical process, Mr. Okoro, not a romantic one. We're not talking about a relationship. We're talking about a biological transaction carried out under controlled circumstances. And if it doesn't work? If there's no pregnancy? The terms remain the same, Catherine said. If we make a genuine attempt over the agreed-upon time frame and conception doesn't occur, you still receive the full compensation. I'm not paying for a result I can't guarantee. I'm paying for your participation and your silence. She sat down again, leaning forward slightly. I'm not asking you to decide everything right now. I'm asking if you can consider this arrangement. If the answer is no, you walk out of here, return to your life, and we never speak of this conversation again. I'll ensure you're not penalized professionally for knowing about it. If the answer is yes, even tentatively, we move to the next phase. Lawyers, medical consultations, detailed contracts. You'll have every opportunity to back out before anything binding is signed. Daniel's throat felt tight. Why are you doing this? You could adopt. You could find someone through normal channels. Adoption means agencies, social workers, questions about why a single woman of my age and status wants a child, Catherine said. It means scrutiny of every aspect of my life, including business practices that certain parties would love to investigate. Normal channels mean documentation, paper trails, people who could talk. I didn't build a $10 billion company by trusting systems designed for average circumstances. I built it by identifying what I want and finding the most efficient path to obtain it. She picked up a pen, tapping it against the desk in a rhythmic pattern. I'm 46 years old, Mr. Okoro. I've spent 2 decades building an empire. I've sacrificed relationships, personal time, every conventional aspect of what people call a normal life. I don't regret those choices, but I'm smart enough to know that life has an endpoint, and when I reach mine, I want to leave something behind that's not just stock portfolios and shareholder value. I want a legacy that's human, not corporate. I want a child, and I want it on my terms. The raw honesty in her voice caught Daniel off guard. For the first time since he'd stepped into this office, Catherine Hale sounded less like a CEO and more like a woman confronting the limitations mortality imposed even on billionaires. You're asking me to sell you a child, Daniel said quietly. No, Catherine corrected. I'm asking you to help me create one, then step aside so I can raise it. There's a difference. The child won't be lacking anything, not love, not resources, not opportunity. What it will lack is a father, but millions of children grow up in single-parent households and thrive. I'm simply being honest about that reality from the start instead of pretending otherwise. Daniel stood, not to leave, but because he couldn't sit still anymore. He walked to the windows, looking out at the city that had chewed him up for 2 years and spit out nothing but struggle. Somewhere down there, in a hospital room he couldn't afford, Marcus was probably waking up, probably checking to see if Daniel had sent any messages. Marcus, who trusted him to figure it out, to make everything okay despite impossible odds. I need time, Daniel said. You have until noon, Catherine replied. My assistant will provide you with a private space and a phone. You can call anyone you trust to discuss this, though I'd strongly advise against it. This offer exists only as long as it remains secret. The moment it becomes public, even as rumor, it disappears and you're back where you started. She stood, moving to open the office door. One more thing, Mr. Okoro. I chose you because my research suggested you're a man of principle, someone who tries to do right even when it costs him. That quality is valuable, but it can also be dangerous in situations where the right choice isn't clear. So let me be very clear about what I'm offering you. I'm offering you survival, not just for yourself, but for your brother. In exchange, I'm asking for something you already have. No one gets hurt. No one is exploited. We're 2 adults making a mutually beneficial arrangement that happens to fall outside conventional social boundaries. The only question is whether you're willing to prioritize survival over convention. Daniel walked to the door, then stopped. If I say yes, and we do this, and the child is born, you promise you'll be a good mother? Catherine's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. Mr. Okoro, that child will have every advantage I can provide. The best education, the best healthcare, the best opportunities. And yes, love, because I'm choosing this, deliberately, which means I've thought about what it means to be responsible for another human life. That child will never doubt it was wanted. Daniel nodded slowly. Noon. Noon, Catherine confirmed. He left her office and walked back down the corridor. But instead of taking the elevator to the ground floor, he followed the signs to an emergency stairwell. He needed to move, needed the physical exertion of descending 47 flights of stairs to clear his head. His feet pounded against concrete steps, echoing in the empty space, and with each floor he descended, he tried to sort through the impossible choice Catherine Hale had laid before him. The rational part of his brain, the part that had been screaming for 2 years that poverty was a trap with no exit, told him this was an answer to prayers he'd stopped believing would be heard. The green card alone was worth more than money. It was freedom, security, the ability to build something instead of just surviving. The $1 million was beyond anything he'd imagined having. Marcus could go to college, could become something more than another kid beaten down by circumstance. But another part of him, the part that had been raised by parents who'd sacrificed everything to give him a chance at education, who'd taught him that some things mattered more than survival, that part recoiled at what Catherine was proposing. Fathering a child he'd never know, signing away all connection to a human being he'd helped create. It felt wrong in a way that transcended logic, wrong in the same way lying to someone who trusted you was wrong even if they never found out. By the time he reached the ground floor, he was breathing hard, his shirt soaked with sweat. He pushed through the door into the basement corridor and nearly collided with Jose, one of the other janitors, who was just starting his shift. "Yo, Danny, you look like you've seen a ghost," Jose said, stepping back. "You all right?" "Yeah," Daniel lied. "Just tired. Long shift." Jose shook his head. "Man, I keep telling you, this job ain't worth killing yourself over. There's other places that treat people better, pay better. You gotta know when to walk away." "Yeah," Daniel said. "I'm figuring that out." He went to the locker room, stripped off his uniform, and stood under a shower that never quite got hot enough. The water streamed over him, and he closed his eyes, trying to imagine what his life would look like in 6 months if he said yes. A new apartment, maybe in a different city entirely. Marcus healthy, enrolled in a good school, with a future that wasn't predetermined by their father's death and their mother's inability to support them. A bank account that didn't make him feel like a failure every time he checked it. And a child out there somewhere, growing up in Catherine Hale's world of wealth and power, never knowing that its father had once scrubbed toilets in the building where its mother commanded an empire. Daniel turned off the water and dried himself with rough paper towels from the dispenser. He dressed in the civilian clothes he'd brought, jeans worn soft from age, a t-shirt from a charity run he'd volunteered at 2 years ago, sneakers that needed replacing. He looked at himself in the mirror above the sinks, seeing the face of a man who'd aged faster than his years, stress and exhaustion carving lines that hadn't been there when he'd first arrived in America full of hope and stupid optimism. What would Papa say? He whispered to his reflection. But he knew the answer. His father would have told him that a man's integrity was the only thing poverty couldn't steal unless you let it. His father would have reminded him that the choices you make when desperate define who you are more than the choices you make when comfortable. His father would have been disappointed. But his father was dead, and the lessons he'd taught hadn't paid the rent or kept Marcus healthy or changed the fundamental math of survival in a country that chewed up immigrants and spit out desperation. Daniel's phone buzzed. Another message, this one from the hospital. He made himself open it. Patient Marcus Okoro requires follow-up pulmonary specialist consultation. Please contact billing department to arrange payment for scheduled appointment. Failure to schedule may result in treatment disruption. Treatment disruption. Clinical language for, your brother might die because you're poor. Daniel closed his eyes, leaned his forehead against the cool mirror, and felt something inside him crack. Not break exactly, but crack in a way that let harsh light into places that had been protected by principles and pride. At 11:47 a.m., Daniel took the elevator back to the 47th floor. The same elevator he'd been pulled out of 6 hours ago, though it felt like 6 years. Catherine's assistant, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and a professional smile, was waiting for him. "Mr. Okoro," she said, "Ms. Hale is ready for you." He followed her back to the corner office. This time Catherine wasn't alone. A man in an expensive suit sat in one of the chairs, a laptop open in front of him, documents spread across the coffee table. "Mr. Okoro," Catherine said, standing, "this is Richard Chen, my personal attorney. Before you say anything, I want you to understand that Mr. Chen will be facilitating this arrangement, but will not be representing you. I've retained separate counsel, someone with no connection to me or my company, to represent your interests. She's waiting on video call if you decide to move forward." Daniel looked at the lawyer, then at Catherine, then at the papers on the table. "I have questions," he said. "Of course," Catherine replied. She gestured to a chair. "Sit. We have time." Daniel sat. Richard Chen closed his laptop, giving him full attention. "You said 6 to 8 weeks living in your home," Daniel began, his voice steadier than he felt. "What exactly does that mean? What would my days look like?" "Clinical," Catherine said. "You'd have your own suite of rooms, bedroom, bathroom, sitting area. Medical staff would monitor both of our health to optimize conception chances. We would have scheduled encounters based on my fertility window. Between those times, you'd have complete privacy. You could work remotely if you wished, though I'd provide a stipend that makes employment unnecessary during this period. You'd have access to my home's amenities, but would be expected to maintain absolute discretion with the staff." "How many staff would know about this?" "3, Catherine said. "My personal physician, who I've worked with for 20 years and who is bound by both medical confidentiality and a separate NDA with severe financial penalties for breach. A nurse who will assist with monitoring, and my head of security, who needs to know for logistical reasons. All 3 have worked for me for over a decade. Their loyalty is absolute. And if someone finds out anyway, if this leaks?" Richard Chen spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone who'd spent years protecting powerful people. "The contracts include mutual non-disclosure agreements with liquidated damages clauses in the tens of millions. If Ms. Hale discloses your identity or participation, you're entitled to compensation that would make the settlement seem modest. If you disclose, the penalties would be severe enough to bankrupt you several times over. The incentive structure strongly favors mutual silence." "What about the birth certificate?" Daniel asked. "Legal documents require a father's name." "Handled," Catherine said. "The legal framework allows me to leave the father's identity undisclosed. The child will carry my surname. From a legal standpoint, you won't exist in any documentation connected to the child." Daniel rubbed his face with both hands. "This is insane." "Yes," Catherine agreed. "We've established that. Do you want to proceed or not?" "I want to talk to the lawyer you hired for me." Catherine nodded to Richard, who opened his laptop again and turned it toward Daniel. A woman's face appeared on the screen. Early 40s, professional but warm, with the kind of expression that suggested she'd seen everything and was shocked by nothing. "Mr. Okoro," she said, "I'm Jennifer Marsh. Ms. Hale has retained me to provide you with independent legal counsel regarding a proposed arrangement. Let me be very clear from the start. I don't work for Catherine Hale. I work for you. My job is to make sure you understand what you're agreeing to and that your interests are protected. Ms. Hale, would you and Mr. Chen mind giving us privacy?" Catherine stood without protest. "We'll be in the conference room next door. Take whatever time you need." She and Richard left, closing the door behind them. Daniel was alone with Jennifer Marsh's face on a laptop screen. "All right," Jennifer said, her voice shifting to something more direct. "I'm going to be honest with you, Mr. Okoro. This is the weirdest fucking thing I've been asked to work on in 20 years of practicing law. It's also technically legal, assuming everything Catherine told you is accurate. But legal doesn't mean it's a good idea for you specifically. So let's talk about what you're actually getting into." For the next hour, Jennifer walked him through every aspect of the arrangement, stopping frequently to ask if he understood, to clarify implications, to point out potential complications he hadn't considered. She was thorough, professional, and notably absent of judgment, which made the conversation easier than it should have been. "Here's what I'm concerned about," she said finally. "You're agreeing to something that has significant emotional and psychological implications that no contract can address. You'll have a biological child in the world that you'll never know. That might not bother you now, but it might in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And the contract makes it clear that you'll have no recourse, no ability to change your mind. Once you sign, you're locked into silence and distance forever. I understand, Daniel said. Do you? Jennifer pressed. Because I've represented men in parental rights cases, and I've seen what happens when biology and law collide. This contract is airtight from a legal perspective, but emotions don't follow contract law. If you wake up in 10 years and decide you want to know this child, you'll have no options. None. The penalties for breach are designed to be absolutely ruinous. What would you do? Daniel asked. In my position? Jennifer was quiet for a moment. I can't answer that, but I can tell you that desperation makes for bad decision-making. Catherine Hale is offering you a way out of poverty, and that's incredibly tempting. Just make sure you're not trading one kind of suffering for another. Daniel nodded slowly. If I do this, can you make the contract stronger, protect me more? I can try, Jennifer said. I've already flagged several areas where we need better protection for you. What happens if the pregnancy results in complications? What happens if Catherine dies before the child is born? What happens if she changes her mind about the settlement? But ultimately, you're in a weak negotiating position. She's holding all the cards. The best I can do is make sure she doesn't add more cards to her hand after you agree. Do it, Daniel said. Whatever protections you can get, I need this. Jennifer's expression shifted to something that might have been sadness. All right, I'll draft amendments. Plan on this taking a few days to finalize. In the meantime, I want you to think very carefully about whether you can live with this choice, because once it's done, it's permanent. The call ended. Daniel sat in Catherine's office, alone with the weight of a decision that would alter the trajectory of his entire life. He thought about Marcus, about his mother in Lagos, about the version of himself who'd arrived in America 15 years ago, believing that hard work and integrity would be enough. That version of himself was naive. This version knew better. Catherine and Richard returned. She looked at him with those cool gray eyes that missed nothing. Mr. Marsh says you're moving forward, she said. It wasn't a question. With amendments to the contract, Daniel replied. I want better protections. Reasonable, Catherine said. Richard will work with her. We're looking at 3 to 4 days for finalization. In the meantime, I need you to undergo a full medical evaluation, blood work, genetic screening, the standard battery of tests. I'll cover all costs. You'll also meet with my physician to understand the medical protocol. She pulled out a check from her desk drawer, already written. This is $50,000. Consider it a good faith payment and compensation for your time during the contract negotiation period. If you decide not to proceed after the contracts are finalized, keep it. I don't make offers like this lightly, and I don't expect free labor even in preliminary stages. Daniel stared at the check. $50,000, more money than he'd earned in 2 years of cleaning floors, just for agreeing to negotiate. He took it with shaking hands. I need to tell my brother something, he said. I can't just disappear for 2 months without explanation. Tell him you got a special contract job that requires you to live on site, Catherine said. It's close enough to the truth. But Mr. Okoro, and this is critical, you cannot tell anyone the real nature of this arrangement. Not your brother, not your mother, not a priest or a therapist or your closest friend. The moment you do, the deal evaporates and you'll be liable for return of all compensation plus penalties. The secret isn't optional, it's fundamental. Daniel nodded. I understand. Good. Catherine stood, extending her hand. We'll be in touch through Richard with next steps. In the meantime, deposit that check and take care of your immediate needs. Pay your rent, pay your brother's medical bills, buy groceries. Consider it an advance on the life you're buying. Daniel shook her hand, feeling the strange electricity of contact with someone whose world was so different from his own that they might as well be different species. Her grip was firm, confident, the handshake of someone who'd built an empire on the foundation of getting what she wanted. He left her office, rode the elevator down 47 floors, and walked out into the morning sun. The city looked the same as it had when his shift started, but Daniel felt fundamentally altered, as if he'd crossed a threshold he couldn't see but could feel. A line between the man who'd scrubbed floors and the man who'd agreed to trade biology for survival. At the bank, he deposited the check, watching the teller's eyes widen as she processed the amount. She asked if he'd like to speak with a financial advisor. He declined. Some conversations required more energy than he had. He paid his rent in full. in person, watching his landlord's surprise at receiving actual money instead of excuses. He called the hospital and arranged payment for Marcus's bills, setting up a consultation with the pulmonary specialist his brother needed. He went to a grocery store and filled a cart with food that wasn't expired or discounted, with fresh vegetables and real meat and the kind of bread that didn't go stale in 2 days. When he finally made it to the hospital to visit Marcus, his brother was sitting up in bed, playing a handheld video game that looked ancient, his thin frame barely making an impression under the hospital sheets. "Hey," Marcus said, looking up with a smile that made every terrible choice feel temporarily worthwhile. "I was wondering if you'd make it today." "Always," Daniel said, settling into the chair beside the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Better. The doctor said my numbers are improving. They're talking about maybe discharging me next week if I keep improving." Daniel felt something ease in his chest. "That's great news, man. Really great." Marcus set down the game. "Danny, I need to tell you something. I know you've been stressing about the medical bills. I heard you talking to the nurses, and I just want you to know, if it's too much, if we need to figure out something else, it's handled," Daniel interrupted. "I got a new job, better pay, good benefits. Everything's going to be okay." Marcus's face lit up in a way Daniel hadn't seen in months. "Seriously? That's amazing. What kind of job?" Daniel had prepared for this question during the walk from the bank to the hospital. Contract work for a tech company. Special project, live on-site situation for a couple of months. It's going to be weird hours, so I might not be able to visit as much, but the pay is enough to cover everything. Your medical care, rent, all of it. It wasn't quite a lie. It was close enough to the truth to let him meet his brother's eyes without flinching. "You're the best, you know that?" Marcus said. "I know I've been in a lot of trouble since I got sick." "You're not trouble," Daniel said firmly. "You're my brother. Taking care of you isn't trouble. It's just what we do." They talked for another hour about nothing important. Video games, music, friends Marcus had met in the hospital, plans for when he was discharged. Normal conversation, the kind Daniel had been too stressed to manage properly for months. Now, with $50,000 in his bank account and a contract in negotiation that would transform their lives, he could pretend for an hour that everything was going to be okay. When visiting hours ended, Daniel kissed his brother's forehead and promised to return in 2 days. "Love you, man," Marcus called after him. "Love you too," Daniel replied. He walked out of the hospital into the afternoon sun, stood on the sidewalk, and let himself feel the full weight of what he'd agreed to. Somewhere in the next few weeks, he would cross another line, would participate in something that couldn't be undone or taken back. He would help create a life, then walk away from it. He would take Catherine Hale's money and use it to build a future for Marcus and himself, and he would spend the rest of his life carrying the knowledge of what that future cost. His phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. "Mr. Okoro, this is Dr. Sarah Winters, Catherine Hale's personal physician. I'm calling to schedule your medical evaluation. Are you available tomorrow morning at 9? "Yes," Daniel said. "Excellent. I'll text you the address. It's a private clinic, very discreet. The full workup will take about 4 hours. Bring your medical history if you have documentation, though I understand you may not have comprehensive records. We'll be thorough regardless." "Okay," Daniel said. "Mr. Okoro," Dr. Winters said, her voice shifting to something warmer, more human. "I want you to know that what you're agreeing to is medically safe. Ms. Hale has been very clear that your health and well-being are priorities in this arrangement. If at any point you have concerns, medical or otherwise, you can speak with me in confidence." "Thank you," Daniel managed. The call ended. Daniel stood on the sidewalk as people streamed around him, everyone absorbed in their own lives, their own struggles, their own impossible choices. None of them knew that the tired-looking man in cheap clothes was about to become part of something extraordinary and terrible all at once. He thought about calling Jennifer Marsh, about asking her again if this was insane, if he was making a mistake that would haunt him forever. But he already knew the answer. Yes, it was insane. Yes, it might haunt him. And yes, he was doing it anyway, because sometimes survival required trading pieces of yourself you'd never get back. Daniel walked to the bus stop and waited for the ride back to an apartment he'd just saved from eviction, in a city that had nearly broken him. in a life that was about to change in ways he couldn't fully imagine. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, beautiful and indifferent to the small dramas of humans below. In her office 47 floors above the city, Catherine Hales stood at her windows, looking down at the streets where she'd started her climb decades ago. She thought about the choice she'd made, the line she'd crossed, the gamble she was taking. She thought about the child she wanted more than she'd wanted anything in 20 years, and about the man who would help her create it without ever knowing it existed. She'd built an empire by making hard choices, by seeing what needed to be done and doing it without sentimentality or hesitation. This was just another move in a game she'd been playing her entire adult life, the game of taking what the world wouldn't freely give, of refusing to accept limits that applied to ordinary people. But late at night, when there was no one to see, Catherine sometimes wondered if there were limits that applied even to her, if there were lines that shouldn't be crossed no matter how much power you had or how desperately you wanted something. She wondered, and then she dismissed the wondering because doubt was a luxury she'd given up the same time she'd decided to build something that would outlast her mortality. In 3 days, the contracts would be finalized. In 4 days, Daniel Okoro would move into her home. In 6 to 8 weeks, if everything went according to plan, she'd be pregnant. And 9 months after that, she'd have what she wanted, a legacy that breathed, that would carry forward into a future she'd never see, that would be hers in a way that stock portfolios and corporate empires could never be. The cost of that legacy was a man's biology, a man's silence, and a child's lifetime of not knowing where half its DNA came from. Catherine told herself those costs were acceptable, that she was paying fairly, that everyone would benefit in the end. She told herself these things because the alternative, acknowledging that maybe some hungers shouldn't be fed, some desires shouldn't be satisfied, was intolerable. The sun finished setting. Catherine returned to her desk, to emails and reports, and the endless work of maintaining power. She didn't think about Daniel Okoro again that night. There would be time enough to think about him when he arrived at her door, his bags packed, his choices made, his future irrevocably altered by desperation and the deal they'd struck. In the game Catherine played, some pieces were pawns and some were players, but in the end, everyone was expendable in service of the king. She'd learned that lesson early and had never forgotten it. She wouldn't forget it now, even as she gambled on biology and trust and the desperate calculations of a man who'd been given an impossible choice. The city turned its lights on, one by one, creating a constellation of human ambition and struggle that stretched to every horizon. Somewhere in that sprawl, Daniel Okoro lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what he'd agreed to and whether he'd ever be able to forgive himself. The answer, though he didn't know it yet, was complicated, like everything else about the arrangement he'd just made. Forgiveness would be something negotiated, compromised, and ultimately settled for less than he wanted, but more than he'd had before. That was the nature of deals made in desperation. Nobody walked away clean, but sometimes walking away alive was enough. The medical evaluation began at exactly 9 a.m. in a clinic that didn't advertise its existence. Daniel found the address Dr. Winters had texted him, a brownstone in a quiet neighborhood where wealth whispered instead of shouted, and pressed the unmarked buzzer. The door opened automatically, revealing a reception area that looked more like a living room than a medical facility. Soft lighting, comfortable furniture, and absolutely no other patients waiting. A woman in her 50s appeared from a doorway, wearing not scrubs but elegant business casual attire. Her silver hair was cut in a precise bob, and her brown eyes carried the kind of sharp intelligence that came from decades of seeing through people's attempts to hide their medical truths. "Mr. Okoro," she said, extending her hand, "I'm Dr. Sarah Winters. Thank you for being punctual." Her handshake was firm, professional, and somehow managed to convey both authority and reassurance. Daniel followed her through the doorway into a corridor lined with actual examination rooms, though even these felt more like upscale hotel rooms than standard medical spaces. "Before we begin the physical examinations," Dr. Winters said, leading him into a consultation room, "I want to establish something important. I've been Catherine Hale's personal physician for 22 years. I know her better than most people on this planet, and I understand why she's pursuing this arrangement. But my first obligation, ethically and legally, is to ensure that any medical procedure I facilitate is conducted with full informed consent from all parties involved. That means you, Mr. Okoro, not just Catherine. She gestured for him to sit in one of two chairs facing each other, a small table between them holding a tablet and some paperwork. She took the other chair, her posture relaxed but attentive. What Catherine is asking you to do is legal, medically straightforward, and will be conducted under optimal conditions, Dr. Winters continued. But I need to know that you understand what you're agreeing to, not just legally or financially, but physically and emotionally. So I'm going to ask you some questions, and I need honest answers. Nothing you say leaves this room unless it's a medical concern that affects the arrangement's safety. Daniel nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. Okay. Why are you doing this? Dr. Winters asked directly. Because I need the money, Daniel said. No point in pretending otherwise. That's honest. But money isn't the only consideration here. You're agreeing to participate in creating a human life that you'll have no connection to. Have you thought about what that might feel like in 5 years? 10 years? 20? My lawyer asked me the same thing, Daniel said. And the answer is I don't know. But I know what it feels like right now to watch my brother struggle to breathe in a hospital bed I can't afford. I know what it feels like to be 3 weeks from eviction. I can't predict the future, but I can respond to the present. Dr. Winters studied him for a long moment. Fair enough. Have you ever fathered a child before? No. Have you ever had unprotected sex? Daniel felt heat rise to his face, but answered honestly. A few times, years ago. Nothing recent. We'll test for STIs as part of the screening, standard protocol. Your employment physical from Hale Industries showed you're in good general health, but I need more detailed information. Family medical history. What do you know about your parents, grandparents, any genetic conditions that run in your family? For the next 30 minutes, Dr. Winters walked through his medical history with the thoroughness of someone who left nothing to chance. She asked about his father's heart attack at 53, his mother's diabetes, his own childhood illnesses, Marcus's asthma, relatives he barely remembered who'd died of various cancers and strokes. She typed notes into her tablet, occasionally asking follow-up questions that demonstrated how carefully she was processing every detail. All right, she said finally. Now for the physical examinations. I'll be drawing blood for a comprehensive panel, genetic screening, hormone levels, infectious disease testing, the works. I'll also be doing a full physical examination. The goal is to establish that you're in optimal health for reproduction and to identify any potential issues before we proceed. Questions? How long until you get results? Most tests within 48 hours. Genetic screening takes a bit longer, 5 to 7 days. We won't move forward until everything comes back clear. She stood. Follow me. The examination was thorough, professional, and more invasive than any physical Daniel had ever experienced. Dr. Winters explained each test as she performed it, maintaining a clinical detachment that somehow made the process less uncomfortable than it might have been. She drew what felt like a dozen vials of blood, took his vitals, examined him in ways that made him grateful for her matter-of-fact professionalism. When it was finally over, Daniel sat in the consultation room again, feeling drained. You did well, Dr. Winters said, making notes on her tablet. Preliminarily, I see no obvious concerns. You're underweight for your height, which isn't surprising given your economic situation, but nothing that affects reproductive viability. Your blood pressure is slightly elevated, likely stress-related. We'll monitor that. Otherwise, you appear to be a healthy 32-year-old male. She set down the tablet and looked at him directly. Mr. Okoro, I'm going to tell you something that Catherine probably won't. This arrangement, while legal and medically sound, is ethically complicated. I've agreed to facilitate it because I believe Catherine will be an excellent mother and because I believe you're entering into this with genuine consent, even if that consent is motivated by financial desperation. But I want you to know that if at any point before conception occurs, you change your mind, you can walk away. Yes, there may be financial penalties according to the contract, but your bodily autonomy supersedes any agreement you've signed. Do you understand that? I think so, Daniel said. Good. Because the moment you feel coerced, the moment this stops feeling like a choice, even if it's an extremely limited choice, you tell me. I won't facilitate anything that crosses that line. She stood, signaling the appointment was ending. I'll contact you when the results are in. In the meantime, take care of yourself. Eat well, rest, try to manage your stress levels. The healthier you are, the better this process will go for everyone. Daniel left the clinic feeling both relieved and more anxious than when he'd arrived. The medical evaluation had made everything more real, had transformed an abstract agreement into something concrete and physical. In less than a week, if his tests came back clear, he would be moving into Catherine Hale's home to participate in something he still couldn't fully wrap his mind around. He spent the next 3 days in a strange limbo, visiting Marcus in the hospital, working his regular janitorial shifts at Hale Industries with the knowledge that he'd soon be leaving them behind, and trying not to think too hard about what he'd agreed to. The $50,000 sat in his bank account like evidence of a crime, money that didn't feel quite real because he hadn't earned it through any labor he understood. On the 4th day, Richard Chen called. The contracts are finalized. Jennifer Marsh has reviewed everything and made her recommendations. Ms. Hale has accepted most of them. You need to come in to sign. The signing took place in a conference room at a law office that occupied 3 floors of a building in the financial district. Jennifer Marsh was there in person this time, along with Richard Chen and 2 witnesses who were apparently professional document witnesses, people whose job was to watch other people sign important papers and attest that it happened. The contract was 63 pages long. Jennifer walked Daniel through every section, explaining in plain language what the legal terminology actually meant. The compensation structure: $1 million, paid in installments over 18 months to avoid tax complications. The green card, processed and delivered within 90 days. Marcus's medical trust, established immediately upon signing. The settlement payment of $250,000, delivered upon confirmed pregnancy. The confidentiality requirements, with penalties starting at $5 million and escalating from there. The parental rights waiver, absolute and irrevocable. The medical protocols, the living arrangements, the timeline, the contingencies for every possible scenario from Catherine's death to Daniel's change of mind to pregnancy complications. This is your last chance to walk away, Jennifer said quietly. Once you sign, you're committed, not just legally, but practically. The penalties for breach are designed to be life-ruining. So I'm asking you one more time, with no one else listening. Are you sure you want to do this? Daniel looked at the contract, at the signature lines waiting for his name. He thought about Marcus, who'd been discharged from the hospital 2 days ago and was staying with a friend's family while Daniel figured out his new job situation. He thought about his mother in Lagos, who he hadn't told about any of this, who still believed her eldest son was working an honest job and building an honest life. He thought about his father, dead 9 years now, whose disappointment he would never have to face. I'm sure, Daniel said. He signed. Richard Chen signed as witness. Jennifer Marsh signed. The professional witnesses signed. Everyone initialed every page, a ritual of documented consent that felt more like a funeral than a business transaction. It's done, Richard said, gathering the documents. Mr. Okoro, you're scheduled to move into Ms. Hale's residence this Friday at 6 p.m. Dr. Winters will meet you there to go over the medical protocols. Ms. Hale asks that you bring minimal personal belongings, clothing, toiletries, perhaps a laptop or tablet, if you have one. Anything else you need will be provided. Daniel nodded, not trusting his voice. Jennifer walked him out of the conference room. In the elevator down, she said, I hope this works out for you. I really do. But Daniel, and I'm calling you Daniel now because we're not in a professional setting anymore, please be careful. Catherine Hale is used to getting what she wants, and she's very good at making people forget they have the right to say no. If things start feeling wrong, if the arrangement deviates from what you've agreed to, you call me immediately, day or night. I mean that. Thank you, Daniel managed. She handed him her business card with her personal cell number written on the back. Stay safe. Friday arrived with the inevitability of scheduled surgery. Daniel packed a duffel bag with clothes, his laptop that was more repair than original parts, toiletries, and a photo of his family from before his father died. He stood in his apartment, paid through the next 6 months thanks to the advance from Catherine, and looked at the space that had been his home for 2 years. It was a shitty apartment by any objective measure, with water damage on the ceiling and a radiator that clanked all winter, but it was his. He'd survived here. He'd kept Marcus safe here, mostly. He'd tried to build something here, even if that something had never quite materialized. Now he was leaving it to move into a billionaire's mansion and father a child he'd never know. The absurdity of it hit him like a wave, and he laughed, a short, bitter sound that echoed in the empty apartment. Then he picked up his bag and left before the laughter could turn into something else. Catherine's home was in a neighborhood where houses were set back from the street behind gates and walls, where privacy was purchased in acres rather than square feet. The address Richard had given him led to a wrought iron gate that opened automatically as he approached, as if the house itself were expecting him. The driveway curved through manicured grounds that probably required a full-time gardener, leading to a modern structure of glass and steel that seemed to emerge organically from the landscape. Daniel parked his beat-up Honda Civic, embarrassingly out of place, in the circular drive and sat for a moment, trying to calm his racing heart. He'd agreed to this. He'd signed the papers. But agreement and acceptance were different things, and as he looked at the house that would be his prison or sanctuary or something in between for the next 2 months, acceptance felt very far away. He got out of the car. Before he could reach the front door, it opened, revealing Dr. Winters. "Right on time," she said with a slight smile. "Come in, Daniel. Let's get you settled." The interior of the house was exactly what he'd expected, and somehow more intimidating for matching those expectations. Open spaces, minimal furniture, art that was probably priceless, and a sense of deliberate design in every corner. This wasn't a home where people relaxed. It was a showcase, a statement, a physical manifestation of Catherine Hale's success and control. "Ms. Hale is on a conference call," Dr. Winters said, leading him through the main floor toward a wing he hadn't seen from the entrance. "She'll join us in about 30 minutes. In the meantime, let me show you to your quarters." His quarters turned out to be a suite of rooms that was larger than his entire apartment. A bedroom with a king-sized bed and furniture that looked like it belonged in a hotel, a bathroom with a shower that could fit 4 people, and a sitting area with a couch, television, and desk by a window overlooking the grounds. Everything was decorated in neutral tones, elegant but impersonal, like a very expensive hotel room. "This is your private space," Dr. Winters said. "The door locks from the inside. You control your own access. The house has staff, but they've been instructed not to enter unless you request service. There's an intercom system if you need anything. The kitchen is available 24/7, though there's also a mini fridge and coffee maker in here if you prefer privacy." She walked to the window, gesturing at the grounds. "You're free to use the outdoor spaces, the gym, the library. The only areas that are off-limits are Ms. Hale's personal bedroom suite and her home office. Everything else is accessible." Daniel set his duffel bag on the bed, suddenly feeling the weight of exhaustion that had been building for days. "When does this actually start? The medical part?" "Tonight, we'll do baseline measurements and go over the protocol," Dr. Winters said. "Tomorrow I'll begin monitoring Ms. Hale's fertility cycle. Based on her recent patterns, we're estimating she'll be at peak fertility in 4 to 5 days. That's when conception attempts will begin." She sat down in one of the chairs, gesturing for Daniel to sit as well. "I want to be very clear about what's going to happen, because the clinical language in the contract doesn't fully convey the reality. You and Ms. Hale will need to have intercourse during her fertile window. Not once, but multiple times over several days to maximize the chances of conception. This will be scheduled, monitored, and conducted under medical supervision in the sense that I'll be tracking both of your health indicators, but the actual encounters will be private." Daniel felt his face heat. "I understand." "Do you?" Dr. Winters asked gently. "Because this is where theory meets reality, and I've found that people often struggle with that transition. You're going to be intimate with a woman you don't know, don't have feelings for, and who views this as a biological transaction. That can be psychologically challenging even when you've agreed to it." "I'll manage," Daniel said, more confidently than he felt. "I'm sure you will. But I want you to know that if you're having difficulties, physical or emotional, you can talk to me. I've arranged for a therapist to be available if you need one, someone who's been briefed on the situation and is bound by confidentiality. There's no shame in needing support through this." Before Daniel could respond, there was a knock on the door. Dr. Winters stood and opened it, revealing Catherine Hale. She'd changed from the business attire Daniel had seen her in before, now wearing casual clothes, dark jeans, and a simple sweater, that somehow didn't make her look any less formidable. Her hair was down, falling past her shoulders, and without makeup she looked both younger and more tired than she had in her office. "Mr. Okoro," she said, stepping into the room. "Welcome. I trust Dr. Winters has made you comfortable?" "Yes," Daniel said, standing automatically. Catherine looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "This is awkward, isn't it? We've entered into an incredibly intimate arrangement, and we barely know each other. I thought we should perhaps remedy that, at least partially. Would you join me for dinner? Just the two of us? No doctors, no lawyers, no one else. Just a conversation between two people who are about to do something unusual together." Daniel glanced at Dr. Winters, who gave a small nod. "I'll leave you both to it. Daniel, come find me after dinner. We'll do those baseline measurements." She left, closing the door behind her. Catherine gestured toward the door leading back into the main house. "Shall we?" The dining room was smaller than Daniel expected, clearly not the formal space for entertaining, but something more personal. A table set for two, windows overlooking a garden where the last light of day created long shadows. A woman Daniel assumed was house staff brought out plates of food, perfectly cooked salmon, roasted vegetables, risotto that looked like it belonged in a restaurant. Catherine waited until the staff member left before speaking. "I imagine you have questions. You've been remarkably restrained in not asking them, but I suspect that's more caution than lack of curiosity. So ask. Whatever you want to know." Daniel picked up his fork, more for something to do with his hands than out of hunger. "Why me? Really? Not the reasons you gave in your office about genetics and desperation. Why me specifically?" Catherine took a sip of wine. She'd poured glasses for both of them, though Daniel hadn't touched his. "I watched you for 3 weeks before I made my decision. I know that sounds creepy, and perhaps it is, but I needed to be sure. I watched how you worked, efficiently, thoroughly, with a kind of dignity that most people don't maintain when they're doing work they're overqualified for. I watched how you interacted with other staff, with respect, even when they didn't respect you back. I had your background investigated, obviously, but I also paid attention to who you are when you think no one important is watching." She set down her glass. "You're probably wondering if I considered other options, other men. I did. But they all had complications, families, ambitions, personalities that suggested they'd become problems later. You were clean in the sense that your life was simple enough to extract you from it without leaving loose threads that could unravel everything. That sounds cold, and it is. I'm not going to pretend this is anything other than calculated." "At least you're honest," Daniel said. "Honesty is efficient," Catherine replied. "Lies require maintenance, and I don't have time for that. So let me be honest about something else. I'm nervous about this. I know how that sounds coming from someone in my position, but it's true. I'm 46 years old, I've built a billion-dollar company, I've negotiated with some of the most powerful people in the world, and I'm nervous about the possibility of becoming a mother. Because that's something I can't control the way I control boardrooms and quarterly earnings. A child is chaos, unpredictability, absolute vulnerability. And I'm choosing it anyway because the alternative, reaching the end of my life having built nothing that will remember me as a person rather than as a CEO, is intolerable." She looked at him directly, and for the first time, Daniel saw something genuine beneath her composed exterior. Fear, maybe. Or hope. Or both. "I'm not asking you to understand that," Catherine continued. "I'm certainly not asking you to approve, but I want you to know that this isn't casual for me. This is the most important thing I'll ever do, and I'm trusting you to help me do it. That trust might be purchased, but it's still real." Daniel found himself speaking before he'd fully thought through his words. "What if it doesn't work? What if after all this you don't get pregnant?" "Then we tried, and I'll deal with that outcome when it comes," Catherine said. "But I'm choosing to believe it will work, because the alternative is accepting defeat before we've started, and I didn't get where I am by accepting defeat." They ate in silence for a few minutes, the awkwardness gradually easing into something more tolerable. Daniel found himself studying her, not as an employer or as the woman who'd bought his participation in her plan, but as a human being who contained contradictions and complications just like everyone else. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. "Of course." "Do you think you'll be a good mother? Not in theory, but actually. When it's 3 a.m. and the baby won't stop crying, and you haven't slept in days, and there's no one to delegate the problem to. Catherine was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, she said finally. I hope so. I've thought about it constantly for 2 years, read every book on parenting I could find, consulted with child psychologists about what children need from their parents. But thinking about it and doing it are different things. I might fail. I might be terrible at it. But I'm going to try with everything I have, and that's all anyone can do. It was the most human thing Daniel had heard her say, and somehow it made the entire arrangement feel slightly less insane. They finished dinner talking about small things, books they'd read, places they'd traveled or wanted to travel, the strange experience of living in a city that felt simultaneously enormous and claustrophobic. Catherine was surprisingly easy to talk to when she wasn't being a CEO, with a dry wit and occasional vulnerability that suggested the person beneath the professional armor was someone Daniel might have liked under different circumstances. When the meal ended, Catherine stood. Thank you for this. I know it's strange, having dinner with me as if we're friends when we're actually business partners in something deeply personal, but I think it helps, knowing a bit about each other before we, proceed. Yeah, Daniel agreed, standing as well. Catherine extended her hand. I'll see you in 4 days. Dr. Winters will handle everything before then. And Daniel, I hope you sleep well. You're safe here. I know that might not feel true given the circumstances, but it is. He shook her hand, feeling that same strange electricity he'd felt in her office. Then she left, and he was alone in a house that wasn't his, about to embark on something that would alter the rest of his life. Dr. Winters found him in his suite 30 minutes later. She conducted the baseline measurements with efficient professionalism: blood pressure, heart rate, temperature, a blood draw to establish hormone levels. She explained the protocol in detail: daily check-ins, supplements to optimize his reproductive health, specific timing for the conception attempts based on Catherine's ovulation tracking. How are you feeling? She asked as she packed up her medical kit. Surreal, Daniel admitted. That's normal. This is a surreal situation, but Daniel, I need you to remember something. You're not just a biological component in this process. You're a person, and your well-being matters. If at any point this becomes too much, you speak up. Understand? I understand, Daniel said. She left him alone with instructions to rest, to eat well, to take care of himself. As if self-care were simple when you just signed away a fundamental piece of yourself for money and security. Daniel lay on the enormous bed in his borrowed suite and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere in this house, Catherine Hale was probably working, responding to emails, managing her empire, preparing for the strange intimacy they'd soon share. Somewhere in the city, Marcus was safe and healthy because of the choice Daniel had made. Somewhere in Lagos, his mother believed her son was living an honest life. The weight of all those somewheres pressed down on him, and for the first time since signing the contract, Daniel allowed himself to feel the full magnitude of what he'd agreed to. Not just the practical aspects, the sex, the pregnancy, the walking away, but the deeper truth that he'd crossed a line most people never crossed, had made a choice that couldn't be rationalized as purely survival because it involved creating a life he'd never know. He thought about the child that might result from this arrangement. A little girl or boy who'd grow up with every advantage money could buy, who'd be loved by Catherine Hale with the same intensity she brought to everything else, who'd never know that their father had been a janitor, desperate enough to trade biology for a green card. Would that child be happy? Would they wonder about the missing half of their origin story? Would Catherine tell them someday, or would she take the secret to her grave? Daniel didn't have answers to any of these questions. He had only the decision he'd already made and the days ahead where he'd have to live with the consequences. He pulled out his phone and texted Marcus. Starting new job tomorrow. Might be hard to reach for a while, but I'm okay. Love you. The reply came within seconds. Love you too. You're the best brother anyone could have. Daniel closed his eyes against the sudden burning sensation. He was the best brother Marcus could have because he was willing to do terrible things for love. That was the truth beneath all the rationalizations and justifications. He was willing to compromise his principles, his sense of self, his connection to a future child, All because he loved his brother more than he loved the person he thought he was. Maybe that made him noble. Maybe it made him weak. Maybe it just made him human, with all the messy complexity that implied. In 4 days, he'd find out if biology cooperated with plans made in desperation. In 9 months, if everything worked, Catherine would have her child and he'd have his money, and they'd both have the burden of a secret that would define the rest of their lives. The house settled into night around him, quiet except for the distant hum of expensive climate control and the occasional creak of a structure too large to ever feel truly occupied. Daniel lay in the darkness and wondered if he'd sleep at all, wondered if Catherine was lying awake in her own suite thinking similar thoughts, wondered if the child they might create would somehow sense the strangeness of its origins, even without knowing the details. Eventually, exhaustion pulled him under, and he dreamed of doors that only opened one way, of choices that couldn't be unchosen, of a life that split into two versions of himself, the one who'd said yes and the one who'd said no. And both of them equally haunted by roads not taken. Morning arrived through windows Daniel had forgotten to cover, sunlight flooding the suite with an intensity that felt accusatory. He woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where he was until the unfamiliar weight of expensive sheets and the absolute silence of a house insulated from the world reminded him. He'd actually slept, despite expecting to lie awake all night wrestling with what he'd agreed to. His phone showed 3 missed calls from a number he didn't recognize and a text from Dr. Winters. Breakfast at 8 a.m. in the small dining room. Come whenever you're ready. It was 7:43. Daniel showered quickly in the bathroom that felt more like a spa, dressed in the nicest clothes he'd packed, and made his way through the house, following half-remembered directions from the night before. He found Dr. Winters alone at the same table where he'd eaten dinner with Catherine, a spread of food laid out that could have fed 6 people. "Good morning," she said, looking up from her tablet. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I expected," Daniel admitted, sitting down across from her. He filled a plate with eggs and toast, suddenly ravenous. "That's good. Your body knows you're safe here, even if your mind is still catching up." She set down the tablet. "I've reviewed your test results. Everything came back clean. No genetic red flags, no infections, hormone levels within optimal range. You're cleared for proceeding with the arrangement." Daniel swallowed a bite of toast that suddenly tasted like cardboard. "And Catherine?" "Ms. Hale's results are also clear. Based on her cycle tracking, we're looking at peak fertility starting tomorrow evening through the following 3 days. That's our window." Dr. Winters pulled up something on her tablet, then turned it toward him. "This is the protocol we'll follow. Daily monitoring of both your vital signs, specific timing for conception attempts based on real-time fertility tracking, supplements, and dietary adjustments to optimize conditions. It's as clinical as we can make something that is inherently not clinical." Daniel stared at the schedule on the screen, seeing his life reduced to medical notations and time blocks. "Does Catherine know that we're starting tomorrow?" "She knows. She's been tracking this for weeks." Dr. Winters pulled the tablet back, her expression softening. "Daniel, I'm going to tell you something that may or may not help. Ms. Hale is just as nervous about this as you are. She's very good at hiding it, but I've known her long enough to see through the armor. You're both entering unfamiliar territory here. That shared vulnerability might make it easier." "Or harder," Daniel said quietly. "Possibly. But I want you to understand that what happens in the next few days doesn't have to be traumatic or degrading. Yes, it's transactional in nature, but it's also 2 people trying to create something neither of you can create alone. There's a kind of intimacy in that, even if it's not romantic intimacy." Daniel wasn't sure he believed her, but he appreciated the attempt at reassurance. They finished breakfast in relative silence, Dr. Winters occasionally making notes on her tablet while Daniel tried to eat enough to seem normal without actually tasting anything he put in his mouth. The day stretched ahead with nothing specific required of him. Dr. Winters suggested he explore the grounds, use the gym, familiarize himself with the house. "You'll feel more comfortable if this starts to feel like a space you belong in, rather than a space you're occupying temporarily," she said. So Daniel wandered. The house was even larger than he'd realized, with rooms that seemed to exist for purely aesthetic purposes. A library with floor-to-ceiling shelves and leather chairs positioned for reading light that changed throughout the day. A music room with a grand piano that looked like it had never been played. A gym that could have serviced a small health club. Everything was immaculate, expensive, and somehow sterile, as if Catherine's need for control extended even to preventing the house from developing any personality of its own. He found himself in the library eventually, drawn to books the way he always was when anxiety needed an outlet. The collection was eclectic: business biographies and economic theory mixed with classic literature and contemporary fiction, science texts alongside poetry, philosophy competing with self-help. It was the first thing in the house that felt genuinely personal, as if Catherine had actually chosen these books rather than hiring a designer to fill shelves. Daniel pulled out a worn copy of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude and settled into one of the leather chairs. He'd read it in college, back when he'd believed education would be his path to something better. The margins were filled with notes and handwriting he recognized from the contract he'd signed, Catherine's neat, precise script, making observations about magical realism and the cyclical nature of family trauma. "That was my mother's copy." Catherine's voice came from the doorway, startling him. She wore workout clothes, her hair pulled back, looking more approachable than he'd ever seen her. She loved Marquez, said he understood that reality and magic were the same thing, just viewed from different angles. Daniel closed the book carefully, suddenly feeling like he'd invaded something private. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize. The library exists to be used." "Ma." She walked into the room, grabbed a bottle of water from a small refrigerator hidden in the cabinetry. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes. Your guest room is nicer than any place I've ever lived." Catherine smiled, a brief flash of something genuine. "I had it redecorated 3 times before I was satisfied. Turns out creating a space that's comfortable but not intimate is harder than it sounds." She sat in the chair opposite him, the bottle of water balanced on the armrest. "Dr. Winters talked to you about tomorrow?" "Yeah." Daniel found he couldn't quite meet her eyes. She said, "We're ready to proceed." "I know this is awkward," Catherine said. "Perhaps impossibly awkward. We're essentially strangers who are about to be more intimate than most people ever are with strangers. I've been thinking about how to make that less terrible, and I don't have good answers. But I want you to know that I don't view this as some clinical transaction where you're just genetic material I'm using. You're a person. What we're doing requires both of us to be present, not just physically, but in some way that acknowledges the strangeness and significance of it." Daniel finally looked at her, seeing the vulnerability she was working hard not to show. "I don't know how to do this. I mean, I know the mechanics, obviously, but the rest of it, neither do I," Catherine interrupted. "I've had relationships, obviously, but nothing that felt this weighted, this consequential. Every time I've been intimate with someone, there was always the possibility of walking away afterward. This time, if everything works, I'm walking away with a child. That changes everything." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what they were about to attempt settling between them like a third presence in the room. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said finally. "And I need you to be honest." "All right. Do you think less of me? For agreeing to this? For being desperate enough to sell something most people consider sacred?" Catherine was quiet for so long that Daniel thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight of consideration that suggested she was genuinely thinking through her response, rather than offering platitudes. "I think you're surviving," she said. "I think you're doing what people have always done when faced with impossible choices. You're choosing the option that keeps the people you love alive. Is that noble? Is it weak? I don't think it's either. I think it's human. And no, I don't think less of you. If anything, I think more of you for being honest about your motivations instead of dressing them up in rationalizations." "But you're using my desperation," Daniel said. "You admitted that." "Yes, I am, and I'm not going to pretend that's ethical or fair. But I'm also not going to pretend I have any other option that gives me what I want. We're both compromising something. You're compromising your principles. I'm compromising my preference for control and predictability. The question isn't whether this is ideal. The question is whether we can both live with it." Daniel set the book on the side table. "I keep thinking about the child, about what they'll be told or not told, about where they came from." "I've thought about that constantly," Catherine admitted. "And I don't have a perfect answer. I won't lie to them. If they ask directly about their father, I'll tell them some version of the truth. But I also won't volunteer information that might make them feel unwanted or like they were the product of a transaction rather than a choice. Because they are wanted, Daniel, more than I've wanted anything in 2 decades. That has to count for something. Does it? Count for something, I mean. When the foundation is this, compromised? Catherine leaned forward, her gray eyes intense. Every child is born into compromise. Parents who aren't ready, relationships that are failing, financial situations that are unstable, genetic legacies that are problematic. The only difference here is that we're being honest about the compromises up front instead of discovering them later. This child will have resources, love, opportunity, and a mother who chose them deliberately. That's more than most children get. Daniel wanted to argue, wanted to push back against the certainty in her voice, but he found he didn't have the energy for it. Maybe she was right. Maybe in a world where children were born into poverty and abuse and neglect every day, a child born into wealth and deliberate choice was lucky, regardless of the unusual circumstances of their conception. Or maybe that was just what he needed to believe to live with himself. Catherine stood, the moment of vulnerability closing like a door. I should let you get back to your reading. Dr. Winters wants to do another check-in this afternoon, just routine monitoring. And Daniel? Thank you for being honest with me. It helps. She left before he could respond, her footsteps fading down the corridor. Daniel sat alone in the library with Garcia Marquez and Catherine's mother's annotations, and the growing certainty that tomorrow would either be the beginning of something or the confirmation that some things couldn't be rationalized into acceptability no matter how hard you tried. The afternoon check-in with Dr. Winters was brief, blood pressure slightly elevated but within acceptable range, supplement regimen reviewed, questions about his mental state that he answered with careful honesty. Yes, he was anxious. No, he didn't think he needed medication for it. Yes, he understood he could back out even now, penalties or no penalties. I'm not going to back out, he told her. I believe you, Dr. Winters said, but I needed to ask. Make sure the choice is still yours and not just momentum carrying you forward. That night, Daniel barely slept. He lay in the expensive bed and watched shadows move across the ceiling as clouds passed in front of the moon, his mind spinning through scenarios and possibilities, and the knowledge that in less than 24 hours, he'd cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He thought about calling Jennifer Marsh, about texting Marcus, about doing anything that would break the isolation of being trapped in his own head with choices that felt simultaneously inevitable and impossible. Instead, he got up at 3 in the morning and went to the gym, running on the treadmill until his legs ached and his lungs burned and his thoughts finally quieted into the simple rhythm of breath and footfall. He showered in the darkness of early morning and returned to his suite as the sky began to lighten, feeling hollowed out in a way that was almost peaceful. Dr. Winters found him at breakfast. Today's the day, she said, sitting down with her eternal tablet. Ms. Hale's hormone levels indicate peak fertility starting this evening. I'll be monitoring both of you throughout the day, and I need you to follow the protocol exactly. Supplements, hydration, rest. This evening at 8 p.m., you and Ms. Hale will meet in the designated room. Designated room? Daniel repeated. Not her bedroom, not yours. Neutral space, prepared for optimal conditions. It's clinical, I know, but it helps maintain boundaries. Dr. Winters pulled up something on her screen. I'll be available throughout the evening if there are any medical concerns, but otherwise you'll have complete privacy. The room is soundproofed, and there are no cameras or monitoring devices. What happens between you and Ms. Hale is between you and Ms. Hale. The day crawled by with excruciating slowness. Daniel tried to read, tried to watch television, tried to do anything that would distract him from the clock advancing toward 8 p.m. Catherine was apparently working from her home office. He could hear occasional voices through closed doors as she conducted video conferences, her professional voice commanding and certain in a way that felt disconnected from the vulnerability she'd shown in the library. At 7:30, Dr. Winters appeared at his suite door. It's time to get ready? Shower? Comfortable clothes? You're not dressing for anything formal here. I need to do one final check of your vitals, and then I'll show you to the room. Daniel did as instructed, moving through the preparations with the mechanical precision of someone going through motions because thinking about what came next would be paralyzing. Dr. Winters took his blood pressure, checked his temperature, asked questions about how he was feeling that he answered automatically. "You're doing fine," she said, though he wasn't sure what fine meant in this context. "Remember, this doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to happen. You and Ms. Hale are both nervous, and that's okay. Just be present with each other. That's all you can do." She led him through the house to a wing he hadn't explored, stopping at a door that looked like every other door except for the subtle keypad lock beside it. She entered a code, and the door opened to reveal a room that was neither clinical nor overtly romantic, somewhere in between, with soft lighting, a large bed with sheets that looked expensive but not intimidating, a bathroom visible through another door, and nothing else. No decorations, no personal touches, just functional space designed for a specific purpose. "Ms. Hale will be here in a few minutes," Dr. Winters said. "I'll be in my office if you need anything, but Daniel, trust yourself. You're capable of this." She left, and Daniel was alone in a room designed for intimacy with a stranger. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hands shaking slightly, and wondered what version of himself would walk out of this room in a few hours. Would he feel different? Would something fundamental have shifted, or would it be just another experience filed away in memory? The door opened. Catherine stepped inside, wearing a robe over what he assumed was very little. Her hair was down, her face free of makeup, and she looked simultaneously powerful and uncertain. A combination he was beginning to understand was her natural state beneath the CEO persona. She closed the door behind her. The lock clicked with quiet finality. "Hi," she said, her voice softer than he'd heard it before. "Hi," Daniel replied, standing up awkwardly. Catherine walked to the other side of the room, putting distance between them. "I've been thinking about this moment for weeks, and I still don't know the right way to begin. We could try to make small talk, pretend this is normal, but that seems dishonest. Or we could just acknowledge that this is strange and necessary, and move forward without overthinking it." "I vote for acknowledging the strangeness," Daniel said. A small smile crossed Catherine's face. "Agreed." She untied her robe but didn't remove it, the gesture hovering between intention and hesitation. "I want you to know something before we do this. I chose you, Daniel, not randomly, not just because you were desperate, but because I saw something in you that I wanted my child to have. Your resilience, your integrity, even when it's been tested, your capacity for loyalty. Those aren't small things. So when we do this, I'm not using you, I'm choosing you." The distinction felt important in a way Daniel couldn't fully articulate. "Thank you for saying that." "I'm not good at vulnerability," Catherine continued. "I've spent most of my adult life building walls and learning to function inside them. But I can't do that here. This requires something I don't usually give: trust, openness, the willingness to be seen, and I'm terrified I'm not capable of it." Daniel found himself crossing the room before he'd consciously decided to move. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough to see the tension in her shoulders, the way she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. "I'm terrified too," he said quietly. "Not of this exactly, but of what it means, what it makes me, whether I can live with myself after." "We'll find out together," Catherine said. She let the robe slip off her shoulders, and Daniel felt something shift in the room. Not desire exactly, or at least not just desire, but an acknowledgement that they were both here, both choosing this, both about to cross into territory that couldn't be mapped in advance. What happened next was both more and less than Daniel had imagined. There was awkwardness, certainly, moments where bodies didn't quite align or where the clinical purpose intruded on the physical reality. But there was also surprising tenderness, a shared recognition that they were both vulnerable in ways that transcended the physical act. Catherine wasn't the controlled CEO in those hours, and Daniel wasn't the desperate immigrant. They were just two people trying to create something neither could create alone, trying to find connection in circumstances that should have made connection impossible. Afterward, they lay in the darkness, not touching but aware of each other's presence in a way that felt more intimate than what had come before. "Are you okay?" Catherine asked, her voice carrying genuine concern. "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "Are you?" "I don't know either." She turned her head to look at him. "But I think we did something important tonight, not just biologically, but in terms of honoring what this is. We didn't pretend and we didn't hide. That matters." Daniel wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that intention could somehow sanctify choices that felt morally ambiguous at best. But he also knew that belief and reality didn't always align, that you could do something with good intentions and still carry the weight of it forever. "What happens now?" he asked. "We wait. Tomorrow evening, we do this again, and the evening after that. 3 attempts during peak fertility. Then we wait 2 weeks to see if conception occurred. Dr. Winters will do the testing." The clinical language felt jarring after the intimacy they'd just shared, but Daniel recognized it for what it was. Catherine rebuilding her walls, reclaiming the control that vulnerability had required her to surrender temporarily. "I should go," she said, sitting up and reaching for her robe. "Dr. Winters wants us to rest separately, maintain some boundaries so this doesn't become more complicated than it needs to be." "Right," Daniel said, though the idea of boundaries felt absurd given what they'd just done. Catherine stood, tying the robe with efficient movements. At the door, she paused. "Thank you, Daniel, for being present tonight, for making this less terrible than it could have been." Then she was gone, and Daniel was alone in a room that smelled like expensive sheets and the ghost of intimacy with a stranger who would be his child's mother if biology cooperated with plans made in desperation. He dressed slowly, his body feeling foreign in a way he couldn't quite name. Dr. Winters was waiting in the corridor when he emerged, her expression professionally neutral. "How are you?" she asked, walking beside him back toward his suite. "Confused," Daniel admitted. "It wasn't what I expected. I don't know if that's good or bad." "It's neither," Dr. Winters said. "It just is. You'll process it in your own time. For now, rest. Tomorrow will be easier, or at least familiar. The third time, easier still. And then we wait to see if any of this worked." Back in his suite, Daniel stood under the shower for a long time, letting water pour over him as if it could wash away the complexity of what had just happened. It couldn't, of course. The choices were made, the lines were crossed, and whatever happened next, pregnancy or its absence, child or no child, he'd carry this night with him for the rest of his life. He texted Marcus before climbing into bed. "Job is going well. Miss you. Talk soon." The reply came immediately. "Miss you too. Proud of you." Daniel closed his eyes against the burning sensation that threatened tears. Marcus was proud of him for doing whatever it took to keep them afloat, for being strong enough to handle a difficult job. If only he knew the real nature of that job, the real cost of the strength Daniel was pretending to have. But he'd never know. That was part of the deal, part of the price. Daniel would carry this secret alone, would smile and accept his brother's pride, while knowing it was built on foundations Marcus could never be told about. Sleep came eventually, fitful and full of dreams that dissolved upon waking, leaving only the emotional residue of guilt and confusion and the strange memory of Catherine's vulnerability in the darkness. The next evening came with the same ritual preparation, the same clinical protocol, the same neutral room. But this time, when Catherine arrived, there was less hesitation. They knew the territory now, knew what was required and what was possible within the strange boundaries they'd established. "Easier?" Catherine asked afterward, both of them lying in the darkness again. "Not easier," Daniel said, "but less frightening." "I'll take that." She was quiet for a moment. "I had a dream last night about the child. Just flashes, teaching them to read, watching them graduate from high school, ordinary moments that felt extraordinary because they were mine. Ours, I suppose, technically, though you won't be there for any of it. Does that bother you? That I won't be there?" Catherine considered the question seriously. "I think it bothers me that you won't get to see what we created together. Not because I want you in their life. That's not part of the arrangement and wouldn't work anyway. But because there's something sad about creating something beautiful and significant and then having one of the creators just disappear, like a writer publishing a book under someone else's name. Maybe that's what I am," Daniel said. "A ghostwriter for biology." "A ghostwriter who deserves credit they'll never receive," Catherine said. She stood, reaching for her robe again. "Same time tomorrow?" "Same time tomorrow," Daniel confirmed. The third evening carried the weight of finality, their last attempt during this fertility window, their last chance to make something happen before uncertainty and waiting took over. There was an intensity to it that hadn't been present before, a shared awareness that this might be the moment that mattered, the specific meeting of biology and circumstance that would result in the child Catherine wanted so desperately. When it was over, Catherine stayed longer this time, neither of them quite ready to let go of the strange intimacy they'd created in this neutral room over 3 nights. "Whatever happens," she said finally, "I want you to know that I'll honor the arrangement. If I'm pregnant, you'll get everything we agreed to. If I'm not, you'll still get everything we agreed to. I keep my promises, Daniel." "I know you do," he said, and realized he believed it. "And I'll be a good mother. Maybe not perfect, maybe not conventional, but good, devoted, present. Everything this child needs." "I believe that too." Catherine sat up, and in the dim light, Daniel saw something in her expression that looked almost like grief. "I wish circumstances were different. I wish I'd met you some other way, that we could have been friends or colleagues or anything other than this, because I think I actually like you, Daniel Okoro, and that makes everything more complicated." "Yeah," Daniel said quietly. "It does." She left without saying goodbye, and Daniel lay alone in the room where they'd created something that might be life or might be nothing, where biology and choice had intersected in ways that couldn't be predicted or controlled. Dr. Winters appeared to walk him back to his suite, her presence a silent acknowledgement that something significant had ended. "Now we wait," she said at his door. 2 weeks. Try not to think about it constantly, though I know that's impossible. Ms. Hale will be working, distracted. You should find ways to stay busy too. The waiting is often harder than the doing. The next 14 days stretched like years. Daniel tried to read, tried to exercise, tried to do anything that would occupy his mind while biology worked or didn't work somewhere beyond his perception or control. Catherine was absent. He saw her exactly once in passing, a brief nod of acknowledgement that carried volumes of unspoken complexity. The house felt larger somehow, emptier, as if the intimacy of those 3 nights had required something from the space that it was now reclaiming. On the 14th day, Dr. Winters appeared at his suite with her tablet and a pregnancy test. "Ms. Hale is waiting in the consultation room. It's time to find out if this worked." Daniel's hands were shaking as he followed Dr. Winters through corridors that had become familiar but never quite comfortable. 2 weeks of waiting had carved out a hollow space in his chest, a cavity filled with equal parts hope and dread that expanded with each step toward the consultation room where Catherine waited. The pregnancy test felt like a verdict waiting to be read, a binary outcome that would determine whether the last month of his life had meant something or nothing, whether the compromises he'd made would bear fruit or leave him with only the weight of choices that couldn't be justified by results. The consultation room was smaller than he remembered, or perhaps Catherine's presence made it feel that way. She sat in one of the chairs with a stillness that seemed almost sculptural, her hands folded in her lap, her expression locked in that neutral mask she wore when emotions threatened to break through. She didn't look up when Daniel entered, and he wondered if she was as terrified as he was of what the next few minutes would reveal. Dr. Winters closed the door with a soft click that sounded like a cell locking. She moved to stand between them, her tablet dark for once, her attention focused entirely on the 2 people whose lives were about to pivot on biology and chance. "Before we do the test," Dr. Winters said, "I want to remind you both that a negative result at this stage doesn't mean failure. Sometimes conception takes multiple cycles. We agreed to 1 attempt during this fertility window, but if the result is negative and both of you are willing, we could try again next month." Catherine finally looked up, her gray eyes meeting Daniel's for the first time since he'd entered the room. In them he saw something he'd never seen before, raw fear, the kind that couldn't be hidden behind corporate composure or careful planning. She was terrified of disappointment, terrified that her meticulous arrangements and sacrificed principles would amount to nothing. "Let's just do the test," Catherine said, her voice steady despite what her eyes revealed. Dr. Winters handed her a small package. "You know the procedure. Bathroom is through that door. Take your time." Catherine stood, took the test without looking at it, and disappeared into the bathroom. The door closed, and Daniel was left alone with Dr. Winters and the sound of his own heart hammering against his ribs. "How are you holding up?" Dr. Winters asked quietly. "I don't know what I want the result to be," Daniel admitted. "If it's positive, I've helped create a life I'll never know. If it's negative, everything we did was for nothing and we have to decide whether to do it again. Those aren't the only two possibilities, Dr. Winters said. If it's positive, you've given Catherine what she wants most in the world and secured your brother's future. If it's negative, you've tried something difficult and learned something about yourself in the process. Neither outcome is nothing, Daniel. Before he could respond, the bathroom door opened. Catherine emerged holding the test stick like it was made of glass, her face completely unreadable. She set it on the table between them without looking at it, then sat back down in her chair. 3 minutes, she said. Dr. Winters, would you watch the time? Dr. Winters checked her watch and nodded. The three of them sat in silence that felt heavy enough to suffocate. Daniel found himself staring at the test stick lying on the table, a small plastic thing that held enormous power, a binary indicator that would determine so much. He thought about Marcus, safe and healthy because of the money from this arrangement. He thought about the green card that would arrive regardless of the test result, the permanent legal status that meant security and opportunity. He thought about the child that might or might not exist, the life that might or might not be forming in Catherine's body at this very moment. The 3 minutes felt like 3 hours. Catherine sat perfectly still, her breathing controlled, her hands still folded in her lap as if moving them would somehow influence the test's result. Daniel couldn't sit still. His leg bounced with nervous energy. His fingers drummed against the armrest until he forced himself to stop. Dr. Winters watched them both with the calm of someone who'd delivered countless test results in her career, who understood that waiting was sometimes the hardest part of medicine. Time, Dr. Winters said finally. She picked up the test stick, looked at it for what felt like an eternity, and then smiled. A genuine smile, warm and full of something that might have been joy. Positive, she said. Congratulations, Catherine. You're pregnant. The word hung in the air like a bell that had been struck, its reverberation spreading outward to touch everything. Daniel felt the world shift slightly, felt reality rearrange itself around this new fact. Pregnant. Life created. The arrangement had worked. The child Catherine wanted so desperately was beginning to form, cells dividing and organizing themselves into something that would eventually be a person. Catherine's reaction was not what Daniel expected. She didn't smile or cry or show any of the joy that seemed appropriate for someone who'd just gotten what they wanted most. Instead, she sat absolutely frozen, her face draining of color, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Her hands, which had been so carefully controlled, began to shake. Catherine? Dr. Winters moved toward her, concerned. Are you all right? I can't breathe, Catherine whispered. Her hands went to her chest, pressing against her sternum as if she could manually force air into her lungs. I can't. I don't. You're having a panic attack, Dr. Winters said calmly, kneeling beside Catherine's chair. It's okay. This is a normal response to overwhelming news. Just focus on my voice. Breathe in for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Out for 4. Can you do that with me? Catherine tried to follow the instructions, her breathing ragged and uneven. Daniel sat paralyzed, watching the woman who commanded boardrooms and built empires fall apart over news she'd orchestrated herself. It was disorienting, seeing her lose control so completely, seeing the cracks in her armor widen into chasms. Daniel, get her some water, Dr. Winters said, not taking her eyes off Catherine. He moved on autopilot, finding bottled water in a small refrigerator he hadn't noticed before, bringing it back and watching as Dr. Winters helped Catherine drink small sips between attempts at controlled breathing. Gradually, color began to return to Catherine's face. Her breathing steadied. The shaking subsided to occasional tremors. I'm sorry, Catherine said finally, her voice hoarse. I don't know what happened. I wanted this. I've wanted this for so long, but hearing it confirmed, knowing it's real. It's overwhelming, Dr. Winters finished. You've spent months planning and arranging and controlling every variable you could control. But now biology has taken over, and you can't control what happens next. That's terrifying for someone like you. Catherine looked at Daniel for the first time since Dr. Winters had announced the positive result. We did it, she said, and there was wonder in her voice beneath the lingering fear. We actually did it. Yeah, Daniel said, not knowing what else to say. We did. I need to run some blood work to confirm and establish baseline pregnancy hormones, Dr. Winters said, helping Catherine to her feet. But the test is quite reliable. Assuming the blood work confirms, you're approximately 2 weeks pregnant. Still very early, which means we need to be cautious. The first trimester carries the highest risk of miscarriage, so we'll be monitoring closely. The word miscarriage seemed to snap Catherine back to herself. What precautions do I need to take? What changes in routine, diet, medication? Dr. Winters smiled. Now you sound like yourself again. Come on, let's do the blood draw, and I'll give you a complete list of recommendations. Daniel, you can go back to your suite. I'll come find you when we're done here. Daniel stood, suddenly desperate to escape the room and the weight of what had just been confirmed. But Catherine caught his arm as he passed her chair. Thank you, she said, looking up at him with eyes that were still frightened but also grateful. I know this is strange and complicated and probably not what you imagined when you agreed to this arrangement. But thank you for giving me this chance. You're welcome, Daniel managed, and then he left before the emotions swirling in his chest could find their way to his face or voice. Back in his suite, he sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process what had just happened. Pregnant. Catherine was pregnant. Somewhere inside her body, cells were dividing and organizing themselves into a human being that was half him and half her. A child was beginning to exist, a life that would grow and be born and grow up with every advantage money could provide, and he would never know them. The reality of it hit him harder than he'd expected. During the waiting period, pregnancy had been an abstract possibility, something that might or might not happen. Now it was real, confirmed, inevitable barring complications. And with that confirmation came the full weight of what he'd agreed to. Not just fathering a child, but fathering a child he'd never meet, never hold, never watch grow up. A child who would exist in the world as a living testament to the choice he'd made in desperation. Daniel pulled out his phone and stared at the last text from Marcus. Hope work is going well. Can't wait till you're done with this job and things get back to normal. Normal. As if anything would ever be normal again. As if he could go back to being the person he was before he'd agreed to Catherine's proposal, before he'd crossed lines he didn't know existed, before he'd helped create a life for money and security. That version of himself felt impossibly distant now, separated by choices that couldn't be unchosen and consequences that would ripple forward into a future he couldn't see. His phone rang, startling him out of his spiral. Jennifer Marsh's name appeared on the screen. He'd almost forgotten that she existed, that there was a lawyer somewhere whose job was to protect his interests in this arrangement. Jennifer, he answered. Daniel, Dr. Winters just called me. She said the test was positive. Congratulations, I suppose, though I'm not sure that's the right word for this situation. Her voice carried the same mix of professional distance and genuine concern that had characterized all their interactions. How are you feeling? Confused? Overwhelmed? I don't know, lots of things. That's understandable. I'm calling because the contract stipulates certain actions following confirmed pregnancy. First, the settlement payment of $250,000 will be deposited into your account within 48 hours. Second, the timeline for your departure from Ms. Hale's residence has been triggered. You'll need to vacate within 1 week unless both parties agree to an extension. Third, there are additional documents you'll need to sign formally waiving parental rights once the child is born, but those can wait until closer to the due date. The practical details felt jarring against the emotional reality. A week? I just leave in a week? That was the agreement, yes. The arrangement was for the conception period only. Once pregnancy is confirmed, your role in the arrangement is complete. Obviously, if complications arise or if Ms. Hale requests your continued presence for some reason, that could change. But as it stands, you're free to go. Free to go. The phrase should have felt liberating. Instead, it felt like abandonment, like walking away from something unfinished, which was absurd because finishing would mean staying for 9 months, being present for the birth, being part of the child's life, all things explicitly forbidden by the contract he'd signed. Okay, Daniel said. I understand. Daniel, I know this is a lot to process. If you need to talk to someone, a therapist, counselor, anyone, don't hesitate. This is uncharted territory emotionally, and there's no shame in needing support. Jennifer paused. And congratulations, truly. What you've done is complicated, but you've also given someone what they wanted most in the world. That's not nothing. After the call ended, Daniel sat in silence, trying to reconcile the different versions of what had just happened. In one version, he'd successfully completed a transaction, provided genetic material, received compensation, and could now walk away to build the life he'd been promised. In another version, he'd become a father in the most incomplete sense possible, biologically connected to a child he'd never know, morally implicated in a life he'd helped create but wouldn't help raise. Both versions were true. Neither felt adequate. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Dr. Winters entered without waiting for permission, her expression serious. "Blood work confirms the pregnancy," she said, sitting down in the chair across from him. "Catherine's hormone levels are good. Everything looks healthy so far. I'm putting her on prenatal vitamins and scheduling the first ultrasound for 6 weeks from now." "That's good," Daniel said automatically. "Daniel, I need to talk to you about something, and I need you to listen carefully." Dr. Winters leaned forward, her hands clasped between her knees. "Catherine is not doing well emotionally. The panic attack you witnessed wasn't just a momentary reaction. She's terrified, and she's terrible at admitting fear because her entire identity is built on being in control. I'm concerned that the next few weeks are going to be very difficult for her, and I'm not sure she has adequate support." "What does that have to do with me? I'm leaving in a week." "I know. And maybe that's the right thing. Clean break, no complicated attachments. But I also think you might be one of the only people who understands what this pregnancy actually means, the full weight of it. You were there for the beginning. You know what it cost her to pursue this. And despite the transactional nature of your arrangement, I've seen the way you two interact. There's mutual respect there. Maybe even the beginnings of something like friendship." Daniel shook his head. "Friendship isn't part of the contract." "No, it's not. But being human is, and sometimes being human means recognizing when someone needs support, even if it's not contractually obligated." Dr. Winters stood. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just asking you to think about it. Catherine won't ask for help. She doesn't know how. But if you offered to stay a bit longer, to be someone she could talk to during these early weeks when everything feels uncertain, I think it might make a difference." She left before Daniel could formulate a response, leaving him alone with the uncomfortable suggestion that his role in this arrangement might not be as cleanly defined as the contract suggested. He'd thought he could walk away once his biological contribution was confirmed, that he could take his money and his green card and disappear into a new life without looking back. But Dr. Winters had just complicated that narrative, had suggested that walking away might be legal but not necessarily right. The next day passed in strange limbo. Daniel packed his belongings. It took less than an hour since he'd brought so little, and tried to imagine leaving this house and never thinking about it again. Tried and failed, because somewhere in these rooms was a woman carrying a child that was half his genetic legacy, and pretending that didn't matter felt impossible even if acknowledging it was complicated. He was sitting in the library when Catherine found him. She looked different somehow, less composed than usual, as if pregnancy were already affecting her in ways that had nothing to do with physical symptoms. "Dr. Winters said you're planning to leave in a week," Catherine said, standing in the doorway, as if uncertain whether she was welcome to enter. "That's what the contract says." "The contract says a lot of things. Some of them are flexible if both parties agree." She moved into the room but didn't sit, instead standing by the windows where morning light painted her in shades of gold. "I've been thinking about that panic attack, about what it revealed. I've spent so long wanting this pregnancy, planning for it, arranging every detail. But now that it's real, I'm terrified. Not of the pregnancy itself or the birth or the physical aspects. I'm terrified that I won't be good enough, that I'll fail at the one thing I've wanted more than anything else." Daniel closed the book he'd been pretending to read. "You'll be fine. You're Catherine Hale. You don't fail at things." "I fail at plenty of things," Catherine said quietly. "I failed at relationships, failed at maintaining friendships, failed at everything that requires vulnerability instead of control. And being a mother, that's nothing but vulnerability. You can't control a child the way you control a company. You can't negotiate with them or intimidate them into compliance. You just have to love them and hope it's enough, and I don't know if I'm capable of that." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest in a way that made Daniel's chest tighten. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Because you're the only person who knows the truth about how this child came to exist. You're the only person I can be honest with about my fears without worrying about judgment or implications. Catherine finally moved away from the window, sitting in the chair across from him. I know you're supposed to leave. I know that's what we agreed to. But I'm asking if you'd consider staying a bit longer. Not in the same role. That's done. But as someone I can talk to during these early weeks when everything feels so uncertain. Catherine, that's not part of the arrangement. It wasn't what we agreed to. I know. I'm asking anyway. Not as your employer or as someone who holds power over you, but as someone who's scared and doesn't have many people she can be scared with. Her gray eyes met his, and he saw in them the same vulnerability he'd seen during those 3 nights in the neutral room. I'll increase your compensation, another 100,000 if you stay for 6 more weeks, until the first ultrasound when we know the pregnancy is viable. This isn't about money, Daniel said, and realized as he said it that it was true. The money mattered, obviously, but this decision felt like it transcended financial calculation. This was about choosing what kind of person he wanted to be, someone who fulfilled his contractual obligations and nothing more, or someone who recognized when another human being needed support, even if providing it was complicated. Then what is it about? Catherine asked. Daniel thought about Marcus, about the lessons their father had taught about helping people when they needed it. He thought about Dr. Winters suggesting that being human sometimes meant going beyond what was required. He thought about the child growing inside Catherine, a child who would never know him, but who deserved to have a mother who wasn't drowning in fear during her pregnancy. If I stay, he said slowly, it has to be clear that this is temporary, that in 6 weeks I'm gone and we go back to the arrangement as originally planned. No contact, no relationship, nothing that could complicate things later. I understand, Catherine said. 6 weeks. Just until I know the pregnancy is stable and I found my footing. That's all I'm asking. And we need to establish boundaries. I'm not your therapist or your confidant or your friend. I'm just someone who's willing to be here while you adjust to this reality. Nothing more. Agreed. Daniel knew he was making a mistake. Knew that staying would make leaving harder, that establishing any kind of connection beyond the transactional would complicate feelings that needed to stay simple. But he also knew that walking away now, when Catherine was clearly struggling, would haunt him in ways that respecting the contract wouldn't prevent. 6 weeks, he said. Then I'm gone. Relief washed across Catherine's face so visibly that Daniel realized how much courage it had taken her to ask for help. Thank you. I know this isn't what you signed up for, and I appreciate it more than I can express. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. Daniel, I meant what I said about this not being about money. If you're staying, it's because you're choosing to help someone who needs it, not because I'm paying you to. The additional compensation is just acknowledgement that your time has value. After she left, Daniel called Jennifer Marsh to inform her of the change in plans. Are you sure about this? Jennifer asked, her tone carrying clear concern. You're extending your involvement beyond the agreed-upon terms. That creates potential complications. I know, but it feels like the right thing to do. Right and legally safe are different things, Daniel. If you're going to stay, we need to draft an addendum to the contract specifying the terms and ensuring your protections remain intact. Then draft it. But I'm staying, Jennifer sighed. All right, I'll have something for you to review by tomorrow. Just be careful, okay? You're already emotionally involved in ways the contract didn't anticipate. Don't make it worse by developing feelings that can't go anywhere. The warning was reasonable, but Daniel suspected it was already too late for that kind of caution. Somewhere during those 3 nights of unexpected intimacy, during conversations in the library, and watching Catherine's vulnerability emerge from behind her carefully constructed armor, something had shifted. Not romantic feelings exactly, or at least not primarily romantic, but a connection that transcended the transactional framework they'd tried to maintain. He was connected to this pregnancy in ways that went beyond genetic contribution. He was connected to Catherine in ways that went beyond compensation and contract. And now he'd agreed to stay, to be present during these early weeks when everything was uncertain and fragile, which meant those connections would only deepen. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt almost like relief, as if some part of him had been waiting for permission to care about what happened next, to be something more than a biological donor who disappeared once his function was complete. That evening, Catherine joined him for dinner. Not the formal meal with staff serving courses, but something simpler, the two of them in the small kitchen making pasta from ingredients they found in a refrigerator that was fully stocked but rarely used. "I didn't know you could cook," Daniel said, watching Catherine dice tomatoes with surprising competence. "My mother taught me. She insisted that relying on staff for everything was a kind of helplessness she wouldn't tolerate." Catherine smiled at the memory. "We'd make dinner together every Sunday, just the two of us. Those are some of my best memories of her." "Is she still alive?" "No, she died when I was 26. Cancer." Catherine's hand stilled on the cutting board. "She wanted grandchildren. Used to joke about how I was too busy building empires to build a family. I think she'd be happy about this pregnancy, even if the circumstances would confuse her." They cooked in comfortable silence, falling into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. When the pasta was ready, they ate at the kitchen counter instead of the formal dining room, and for the first time since arriving in this house, Daniel felt like he was simply sharing a meal with another person, rather than participating in a carefully orchestrated arrangement. "Can I ask you something?" Catherine said between bites. "And I want an honest answer, not what you think I want to hear." "Okay. Do you regret this? Agreeing to the arrangement? Going through with it? Everything?" Daniel considered the question seriously. "I don't know yet. Ask me in 10 years when I've had time to understand what it means to have a child in the world I can't know. But right now, in this moment, no, I don't regret it. It was an impossible choice made in impossible circumstances, and I did what I needed to do. Whether that's something I can be proud of or something I'll have to live with, I guess time will tell." "That's fair," Catherine said. "I hope it's something you can be proud of eventually. Because from my perspective, you've given me the greatest gift anyone could give. And I know that sounds transactional and maybe even exploitative given how we got here. But it's true." The 6 weeks that followed established a pattern that was both strange and oddly comfortable. During the days, Catherine worked from her home office, and Daniel explored the city, visited Marcus, who was thriving now that medical bills weren't a constant crisis, and tried to imagine what his life would look like once he finally left this arrangement behind. During the evenings, he and Catherine would have dinner together, talking about everything and nothing: her work, his plans, books they were reading, the small anxieties of early pregnancy that Catherine was learning to navigate. She told him about the morning sickness that started in week 4, appearing with a vengeance that made her grateful she could work from home. She told him about the constant fatigue, about how her body was already changing in small ways that made the pregnancy feel more real. She told him about her fears, that something would go wrong, that the ultrasound would show problems, that she'd miscarry and have to face the loss of this child she'd wanted so desperately. Daniel listened, offered what reassurance he could, and tried not to think too hard about how invested he was becoming in a pregnancy that had nothing to do with him beyond genetic contribution. Tried and failed, because it was impossible not to care when Catherine showed him articles about fetal development, or talked about nursery designs, or worried aloud about balancing work and motherhood. Dr. Winters watched their growing friendship with professional concern. "You're getting attached," she told Daniel after a routine check-in. "Both of you. That's going to make leaving much harder." "I know," Daniel said, "but I can't walk away when she needs support. That's not who I am." "Then make sure you know where the lines are," Dr. Winters warned, "because those lines are going to get increasingly blurry the longer you stay." The 6-week ultrasound appointment arrived with the weight of a final exam. Catherine was terrified. Daniel could see it in the way she held herself too carefully, in the slight tremor in her hands as they sat in Dr. Winters' office, waiting for the technician to arrive. He'd offered to stay in his suite during the appointment, to respect the boundary between his role and Catherine's pregnancy, but she'd asked him to come. Needed him there, she'd said, because this was the moment when they'd find out if everything they'd done had resulted in a viable pregnancy or if complications were already emerging. The technician was a kind-faced woman in her 50s who set up the ultrasound equipment with practiced efficiency. Catherine lay on the examination table, her shirt pulled up to expose her stomach that didn't yet show any sign of pregnancy, and Daniel stood near the door, uncertain of where he belonged in this moment. "Ready?" the technician asked. Catherine reached out her hand, not to the technician or to Dr. Winters, but to Daniel. "Stay close," she said. "Please." He moved to stand beside the examination table, and Catherine's hand found his and gripped it tightly enough to hurt. The technician applied gel to Catherine's stomach and pressed the ultrasound probe against her skin, and suddenly the room was filled with sound, rapid, rhythmic, impossibly fast. "That's the heartbeat," the technician said, smiling. "Strong and healthy, 152 beats per minute. Let me get you a visual." She adjusted the probe and the screen flickered to life, showing grainy black and white images that Daniel's untrained eye couldn't parse. But the technician could, her finger tracing shapes on the screen as she explained what they were seeing. "There's your baby, about the size of a raspberry right now. You can see the head here, the body here, little limb buds starting to form. Everything looks exactly as it should for 6 weeks gestation. Congratulations, Ms. Hale. You have a very healthy pregnancy." Catherine's grip on Daniel's hand tightened even more, and when he looked down at her, he saw tears streaming down her face. Not tears of fear or sadness, but pure, overwhelming joy mixed with relief that the pregnancy was real and viable and healthy. "Can you print that image?" Catherine asked, her voice shaking. "I want to keep it." "Of course. I'll print several copies." The appointment continued with measurements and additional scans, but Daniel barely registered any of it. He was too focused on the sound of that heartbeat, impossibly fast, the audible proof that their 3 nights together had resulted in life, that this child Catherine wanted so desperately was growing exactly as it should. When the appointment ended and the technician left to print the images, Catherine sat up and looked at Daniel with an expression he'd never seen before. Complete, unguarded happiness. "We did it," she whispered. "Everything's okay. The baby's okay." "Yeah," Daniel said, his throat tight. "The baby's okay." Dr. Winters smiled at them both, but Daniel caught the concern in her eyes. The awareness that the moment had been too intimate, too connected, too far from the transactional arrangement they'd agreed to maintain. That night, after Catherine had gone to her suite with printed ultrasound images clutched in her hands, Daniel sat in his own suite and faced the reality he'd been avoiding. He cared about this pregnancy. He cared about Catherine. And most dangerously, he was beginning to care about the child whose heartbeat he'd heard that afternoon, the tiny life taking shape that was half him in the most fundamental biological sense, which meant Dr. Winters was right. Leaving was going to be much harder than he'd anticipated. The 6 weeks were up. Tomorrow, according to their agreement, he was supposed to pack his things and walk away, returning to his life with his money and his green card and the burden of secrets that would follow him forever. But when morning came and he went to find Catherine to tell her he was leaving as planned, he found her in the library, reading a book about pregnancy and child development, the ultrasound image tucked into the pages like a bookmark. She looked up when he entered, and before he could say anything, she spoke. "I need to tell you something," Catherine said, and her voice carried a weight that made Daniel's chest constrict. "Something I should have told you weeks ago, but didn't have the courage to admit." Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched Catherine close the book, her fingers lingering on the ultrasound image before she set it aside. The morning light streaming through the library windows painted her face in stark relief, highlighting the shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and the tension in her jaw that suggested whatever she was about to say had been weighing on her for far too long. "What is it?" Daniel asked, moving further into the room but not sitting, as if remaining standing would somehow protect him from whatever revelation was coming. Catherine stood as well, creating distance between them by moving to the windows, her back to him as she gathered her words. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than he'd ever heard it, stripped of the commanding certainty that usually defined her. "I told you I chose you because of your genetics, your resilience, your desperation. All of that was true, but it wasn't the complete truth." She turned to face him, and Daniel saw something in her expression that looked like shame. "I chose you because I'd been watching you for 6 months, not 3 weeks. I chose you because somewhere during those months of seeing you work with dignity, despite being invisible to everyone around you, I developed feelings I had no right to develop." The words landed like a physical blow. Daniel felt the room tilt slightly, felt his understanding of the entire arrangement shift beneath him like sand. "What are you saying?" he managed. I'm saying that this was never purely transactional for me, even though I convinced myself it was. I'm saying that when I made you that offer in my office, part of me hoped that going through with it might create some kind of connection between us, something that could become more than what the contract outlined. Catherine's hands were shaking now, her carefully maintained control fracturing. I'm saying I used your desperation to get something I wanted, and I told myself it was just about having a child, but it was also about having you in my life in some capacity, even if that capacity was temporary and paid for. Daniel couldn't breathe. The walls of the library seemed to close in as he processed what she was admitting, that the clinical arrangement he'd convinced himself to accept had been based on deception, that Catherine's feelings had been involved from the beginning, even as she'd insisted on purely biological terms. "You lied to me," he said, his voice flat. "No, I never lied, but I omitted crucial information, and that's essentially the same thing." Catherine moved toward him, then stopped when she saw him take a step back. "I'm not telling you this to manipulate you or to change the arrangement. I'm telling you because yesterday, when you were standing next to me during the ultrasound, holding my hand while we listened to our child's heartbeat, I realized I couldn't let you leave without knowing the truth, even if it means you hate me. Even if it destroys whatever friendship we've built, you deserve to know what you were really part of." "Our child," Daniel repeated, the words tasting strange in his mouth. "You said our child." "Yes, because that's what it is, isn't it? We keep pretending this is just biology, just genetic material being transferred according to contract, but we created a life together, Daniel. That baby has your DNA and mine. That makes it ours, regardless of what the legal documents say." Daniel felt fury rising in his chest, hot and sharp. "You don't get to change the terms now. You don't get to suddenly decide this is our child after you spent weeks insisting I had no claim to it, no connection to it, no role beyond biological donor. You wrote a contract specifically designed to erase me from this child's life. And now you're standing here telling me you had feelings the whole time? What am I supposed to do with that information, Catherine?" "I don't know," she said, and tears were running down her face now, the first time Daniel had seen her cry. "I don't know what you're supposed to do with it. I just knew I couldn't let you walk away without telling you the truth, without admitting that I've been lying to both of us about what this arrangement really meant to me." "And what does it mean to you?" Daniel demanded, anger making his voice harsh. "What do you want from me now? Because if you're about to suggest we tear up the contract and play house together, that's not happening. I signed away my parental rights. I agreed to disappear. That was the deal, and you don't get to renegotiate just because you suddenly developed a conscience." I don't want to renegotiate," Catherine said, wiping at her tears with an angry gesture as if furious at herself for showing weakness. "I know what we agreed to. I know what has to happen. You leave, I raise this child alone, and we never speak again. That was always the plan, and it's still the plan. But I needed you to know that for me, this was never just a transaction. For me, every moment of the past 2 months has been colored by feelings I wasn't supposed to have for someone I was essentially paying to father my child." Daniel laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it. "You're incredible. You know that? You've managed to take something that was already impossibly complicated and make it exponentially worse. I was dealing with enough guilt about creating a life I'd never know. Now I get to add the knowledge that I was part of some elaborate fantasy you were living out, where the janitor you developed feelings for gets paid to give you everything you want while pretending not to exist afterward." "That's not fair," Catherine said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Fair? You want to talk about fair?" Daniel's anger was fully unleashed now, words pouring out that he'd been holding back for weeks. "Fair would have been telling me up front that you had feelings for me before asking me to father your child. Fair would have been giving me complete information so I could make an actual informed decision instead of agreeing to something based on partial truth. Fair would have been acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, asking someone you have feelings for to impregnate you and then disappear forever is fundamentally fucked up." Catherine flinched at his words, but didn't defend herself. She stood there taking the verbal assault, and something about her complete lack of defense deflated Daniel's anger as quickly as it had risen. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked, exhausted suddenly. "What possible good can come from this confession?" "Because I'm a coward," Catherine said quietly. "Because I let you leave without knowing the truth, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering if things could have been different if I'd just been honest. and because you deserve to make your next choice, whether to stay or go, with complete information about what you're walking away from. I'm not walking away from anything, Daniel said. There's nothing to walk away from. The contract is clear. My role is finished. The fact that you caught feelings doesn't change the legal reality of our situation. I know, but Daniel, there's something else. Catherine moved back to the chair where she'd been sitting, lowering herself into it as if her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. And Dr. Winters told me yesterday that the first trimester is going to be difficult, not just physically, but emotionally. She's concerned about my stress levels, about how pregnancy is affecting my ability to manage the company. She suggested I might need support beyond what she can provide medically. And you want me to be that support, Daniel finished. That's what this confession is really about. You want me to stay longer because you've realized you can't do this alone, and you're hoping that telling me you have feelings will somehow obligate me to help you. No, Catherine said firmly. I'm telling you I have feelings because I owe you the truth. Whether you stay or go is entirely your decision, and it should be based on what you want, not on what I want or need. If you leave today, I'll manage. I'll find a therapist, lean on Dr. Winters, hire additional staff, whatever I need to do. I won't guilt you into staying by claiming I can't survive without you. Daniel ran both hands through his hair, pacing the length of the library like a caged animal. His mind raced through possibilities and implications, trying to find solid ground in a situation that had become infinitely more complicated in the span of 10 minutes. I need time to think, he said finally. I need to process this without you in the room looking at me with those eyes that make me forget how angry I am. Take all the time you need, Catherine said. I'll be in my office. And Daniel, whatever you decide, I'm sorry for not being honest from the beginning, for using your desperation, for making this harder than it needed to be. I'm sorry for all of it. Daniel left the library without responding, walking through the house with no destination in mind, just needing to move. He ended up in his suite, sitting on the edge of the bed, where he'd spent the last 2 months trying to convince himself that this arrangement was purely transactional, that his participation didn't make him complicit in something morally questionable, that he could walk away when it was over and return to being the person he was before. Catherine's confession had shattered those comfortable lies. The arrangement had never been purely transactional, at least not for her. And if he was honest with himself, it hadn't been purely transactional for him either. Somewhere during those 3 nights in the neutral room, during dinners in the kitchen and conversations in the library and watching Catherine's vulnerability emerge from behind her armor, he'd started to care about her in ways that transcended the contract they'd signed. He'd told himself it was just empathy, just human connection in an unusual situation. But if he was being truly honest, it was more than that. He liked Catherine, admired her even, despite the morally questionable choice she'd made in pursuing this arrangement. There was something compelling about her fierce intelligence, her determination, her willingness to be vulnerable when it cost her something. In different circumstances, under different conditions, he might have... Daniel cut off that line of thinking before it could fully form. Different circumstances didn't matter. They existed in these circumstances, where she was a billionaire CEO carrying his child according to a contract that required him to disappear from both their lives once his biological contribution was confirmed. Except she'd just told him she had feelings for him. Had feelings before the arrangement even began, which meant everything he'd understood about his role in this situation was based on incomplete information. His phone rang. Jennifer Marsh. He almost didn't answer, but professional obligation overrode emotional exhaustion. Daniel, I just got a very disturbing call from Dr. Winters, Jennifer said without preamble. She's concerned about Ms. Hale's emotional state and about the nature of your ongoing involvement. She seems to think you're developing feelings for each other that go beyond the contractual arrangement. Please tell me that's not true. I don't know what's true anymore, Daniel admitted. Catherine just told me she's had feelings for me since before she made the offer. That she chose me partially because of those feelings, not just because of genetics or desperation. Jennifer was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the careful precision of someone delivering bad news. That changes everything legally. If she developed feelings before the arrangement began, it could be argued that the contract was entered into under false pretenses. More importantly, if both of you have feelings for each other, the parental rights waiver becomes much more complicated. Courts don't look kindly on biological fathers being coerced into giving up rights, especially if emotional manipulation was involved. I wasn't coerced, Daniel said. I made my choice. With incomplete information. Daniel, I need you to listen to me very carefully. If you stay in that house one more day, if you continue this relationship with Ms. Hale in any capacity, you're opening yourself up to serious complications. The contract specified a clean break after conception was confirmed. Every day you remain involved creates precedent for ongoing connection, which could give you legal grounds to claim parental rights later, even if you think you don't want them now. What if I do want them? Daniel heard himself say the words before he'd fully thought them through. What? What if I want to be part of this child's life? The question hung in the air, radical and terrifying. Not in spite of the contract, but because the contract was based on false premises. Catherine admits she wasn't honest about her motivations. That has to mean something legally, right? Jennifer's sigh was audible through the phone. It means opening a legal battle that would cost both of you enormous amounts of money and emotional energy, that would likely result in custody arrangements neither of you wants, and that would be incredibly traumatic for the child once they're old enough to understand their origin story. Daniel, I know this situation has gotten emotionally complicated, but you need to think very carefully before you go down this road. Is this really what you want, or are you just reacting to Catherine's confession? Daniel closed his eyes, trying to sort through the tangle of emotions in his chest. What did he want? He'd signed up for money and security, for the chance to save Marcus and build a stable life. He hadn't signed up for feelings, for connection, for the growing certainty that walking away from this child would haunt him in ways no amount of money could compensate for. I don't know, he said honestly, but I think I need to find out before I make any decisions. Then talk to Catherine. Have an actual conversation about what both of you want, not what the contract says you're supposed to want. But Daniel, be careful. She's a very wealthy, very powerful woman who's used to getting what she wants. Make sure whatever decision you reach is actually yours, and not just you responding to her needs or her guilt. After the call ended, Daniel sat in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then he stood, straightened his shoulders, and walked to Catherine's home office. He knocked once and entered without waiting for permission. Catherine looked up from her desk, her face carefully neutral despite the redness around her eyes that suggested she'd been crying. We need to talk, Daniel said, really talk, with complete honesty, about what happens next. Catherine nodded, closing her laptop and giving him her full attention. All right, complete honesty. Where do you want to start? With what you actually want, Daniel said, sitting in one of the chairs facing her desk. Not what the contract says, not what you think you're supposed to want, but what you actually want in your ideal scenario where nothing is off limits. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against the desk in that rhythmic pattern he'd noticed before when she was thinking. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I want you to be part of this child's life, not as a distant biological donor who provided genetic material, but as a father. A real father who's present and involved and knows them. She looked up at him, and the naked vulnerability in her eyes was almost painful to witness. I want us to figure out how to co-parent despite the incredibly unusual circumstances of how we got here. I want this child to grow up knowing both parents love them, even if those parents have a complicated relationship that doesn't fit conventional categories. And what about us? Daniel asked. What do you want there? Honestly, I don't know. I have feelings for you, that much I've admitted, but I don't know if those feelings are genuine attraction or just gratitude mixed with intimacy born from unusual circumstances. I don't know if we could have a real relationship or if we're fundamentally too different, from two different worlds to make it work. Catherine stood, moving around the desk to lean against it, closer to Daniel but not quite touching. What I do know is that I don't want you to disappear from my life completely. Whether that means friendship or co-parenting or something more, I don't know. But complete absence feels wrong in a way the contract never accounted for. Daniel felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. I've been lying to myself too, he admitted, telling myself I could walk away from this child without it destroying something fundamental in me, telling myself that being a father just for money was acceptable because I was desperate. But Catherine, I heard that heartbeat yesterday. I saw that ultrasound, and I can't pretend anymore that I'm okay with never knowing this child. So what do we do? Catherine asked. The contract is legally binding. We can't just ignore it because we've developed inconvenient feelings. We could challenge it, Daniel said. Jennifer thinks the false pretenses, you not being honest about your feelings, might give us grounds to void the parental rights waiver. Catherine shook her head. That would mean a legal battle. Months or years of fighting, media attention once it becomes public, enormous costs on both sides. And at the end of it, what? Joint custody of a child who'll grow up knowing their parents went to court over whether one of them should exist in their life? That's not what I want for this baby. Then what's the alternative? I just leave and we both spend the rest of our lives wondering what might have been if we'd been honest from the start. No, Catherine said firmly. She moved closer, standing directly in front of Daniel's chair, close enough that he had to look up to meet her eyes. The alternative is we tear up the contract. Not legally. We probably can't do that without complications. But practically. We agree that whatever that document says, it doesn't define what we actually do. We create something new, something that works for both of us and for this child. Catherine, you can't just unilaterally decide to ignore a legally binding contract because it's become inconvenient. Watch me. There was steel in her voice now, the commanding certainty that had built an empire. I've spent my entire adult life following rules and contracts and carefully negotiated agreements. And where has it gotten me? Alone in a house that's too big? Carrying a child I almost didn't have because I was too afraid to want something outside the parameters of what's professionally acceptable. I'm done with that. I'm done letting fear and convention dictate my choices. She knelt in front of his chair, bringing herself to eye level with him, her hands resting on the armrests in a gesture that felt both intimate and beseeching. Daniel, I'm asking you to stay. Not for 6 more weeks, not with an expiration date, but to actually be here for this pregnancy and for this child. To figure out with me what co-parenting looks like when the parents barely know each other but are trying to do right by the life they created. To give this child what I never had. 2 parents who chose to be present instead of 1 parent making do alone. Daniel felt tears burning behind his eyes. What about Marcus? What about my green card and the money and all the practical reasons I agreed to this in the first place? You still get everything we agreed to. The green card is already in process. The money is yours, already paid plus the additional compensation we discussed. Marcus's medical trust is established and funded. None of that changes. The only thing that changes is that instead of disappearing, you stay and we figure out what comes next together. Jennifer says staying creates legal complications. Jennifer is paid to worry about legal complications. I'm asking you to worry about what's right for this child and for both of us. Catherine's hands moved from the armrests to rest lightly on Daniel's knees, the touch simultaneously hesitant and grounding. I know this is asking a lot. I know you didn't sign up for actual fatherhood, for the reality of co-parenting with someone you're barely friends with, but I'm asking anyway because I think we can give this child something better than what the contract outlined. Something messy and complicated, but also real. Daniel looked at her. This woman who'd upended his life with an impossible offer, who'd been dishonest about her motivations but was trying to be honest now, who was offering him something he'd thought was forever out of reach, and felt the last of his resistance crumble. I need to call Marcus, he said. I need to tell him the truth. Not all of it, but enough that he understands why I'm making this choice. Of course, Catherine said, standing and giving him space. Daniel pulled out his phone and stepped out onto the terrace connected to Catherine's office. Marcus answered on the second ring. Hey, what's up? I thought you were still doing that contract job. I am, but Marcus, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interrupting. Daniel took a deep breath. The job I've been doing, it's not what I told you. I've been helping someone who needed something only I could provide, and it's gotten complicated in ways I didn't expect. But the important thing is that I'm going to be staying here longer than planned, a lot longer, and my life is going to look different going forward. Different how? Marcus's voice carried concern. Danny, are you in trouble? No, not trouble, just complicated. I can't explain everything over the phone, and some of it I can't explain at all because it's confidential. But I need you to trust me that I'm making the right choice, even if it's not the choice I thought I'd make when this started." There was a long silence. Then Marcus said, "Does this have to do with a woman?" Daniel laughed despite himself. "How did you know?" "Because you sound the way Dad used to sound when he talked about Mom, like you're terrified and excited and confused all at the same time. So yeah, I'm guessing there's a woman involved." "There is, and there's going to be a baby, and I'm going to be part of that baby's life, which means my life is going to change in ways I'm still figuring out." "You're going to be a dad?" Marcus's voice rose with excitement. "That's amazing. Why do you sound like it's a problem?" "Because it's complicated, little brother. The circumstances aren't conventional, and there's a lot I can't explain. But yes, I'm going to be a father, and I'm scared to death, but I'm also starting to think it might be the best thing that's ever happened to me." "Then I'm happy for you," Marcus said simply. "Whatever the complicated parts are, you'll figure them out. You always do. And Danny, I'm proud of you for being brave enough to want something even when it's scary." After they hung up, Daniel stood on the terrace for a few more minutes, letting his brother's words settle in his chest. Then he went back inside where Catherine was waiting, her expression carefully neutral, as if she'd prepared herself for rejection. "I'm staying," Daniel said. "Not because of the money or the contract or even because you asked. I'm staying because I want to know this child, because I want to be their father in a real way, not just a biological donor who disappeared, because I think maybe we can figure out how to make this work despite all the ways it shouldn't." Catherine's face transformed, relief and joy, and something that might have been love flooding her expression. "Really? You're sure?" "I'm terrified, and it's probably a terrible decision, and we're going to have to figure out 1,000 impossible details. But yes, I'm sure." She crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and threw her arms around him in a hug that was fierce and desperate and full of gratitude. Daniel held her, feeling her body shake with sobs she'd been holding back, and realized that somewhere during the past 2 months, she'd become important to him in ways that transcended contracts and compensation. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "Thank you for giving us a chance to do this right." "We don't even know what right looks like," Daniel said, but his arms tightened around her. "No, we don't. But we'll figure it out together." They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in Catherine's office while the city hummed beyond the windows and the future stretched ahead, uncertain and terrifying and somehow full of possibility. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were crying, but it felt like relief more than sadness. "We need to call Jennifer," Daniel said. "Figure out the legal implications of me staying." "We'll call her together," Catherine agreed, "and Dr. Winters, and we'll start making actual plans instead of just following the script the contract laid out." "I don't have any idea how to be a father," Daniel admitted. "I'm barely managing to be a functional adult most days." "I don't have any idea how to be a mother," Catherine said. "We'll learn together, and we'll probably make mistakes, but at least we'll be making them honestly instead of hiding behind carefully negotiated agreements." The days that followed were a strange adjustment period as they tried to figure out what their new arrangement actually looked like. Jennifer was initially horrified, warning about legal complications and the impossibility of simply ignoring a binding contract. But she eventually agreed to draft new documents that formalized Daniel's parental rights while protecting both parties' interests. Dr. Winters was more supportive, suggesting that having both parents present and involved would be better for the child's development regardless of how unconventional the circumstances. Daniel moved from the guest suite to a permanent bedroom in a different wing of the house, establishing his own space while still being present. He and Catherine established routines: breakfast together most mornings, dinner several evenings a week, regular check-ins about how they were both feeling as the pregnancy progressed. They attended doctor's appointments together, watching on ultrasounds as the tiny raspberry-sized embryo grew into something increasingly recognizable as human. Marcus visited twice, once meeting Catherine briefly and immediately declaring that Danny had definitely upgraded from his previous living situation. Their mother called from Lagos, and Daniel told her a version of the truth, that he was going to be a father, that it was complicated, that he was happy despite the complications. She'd cried with joy and promised to fly over once the baby was born. The most difficult adjustment was figuring out what their relationship actually was. They weren't together romantically. Both of them agreed that rushing into a relationship while already navigating pregnancy and new co-parenting arrangements would be too much. But they also weren't just roommates or business partners anymore. They existed in some undefined space between friendship and something more, learning each other's rhythms and habits, discovering shared interests and fundamental differences, building a foundation for whatever came next. Some days were easy, full of comfortable conversation and shared excitement about the coming child. Other days were hard, full of arguments about parenting philosophies they'd never had to articulate before, or tensions from the fundamental power imbalance between a billionaire and a former janitor trying to find equal footing. But they kept showing up, kept trying, kept choosing to be present even when it was difficult. And slowly, something began to shift. The awkwardness eased, the conversations deepened, the moments of genuine connection began to outnumber the moments of tension. 3 months into the pregnancy, on a night when they were sitting together in the library reading about childhood development, Catherine set down her book and looked at Daniel. "I need to tell you something," she said. Daniel felt a familiar surge of anxiety. If this is another confession about feelings or hidden motivations, I'm not sure I can handle it. Catherine laughed. "No, nothing like that. I just wanted to say that I'm glad you stayed. Not just for the baby's sake, though that's obviously important, but for mine too. These past few months, getting to know you without the contract hanging over everything, it's been good. Better than good. It's been the most honest relationship I've had in years." "Even though we're not actually in a relationship?" Daniel asked. "Especially because we're not rushing into a relationship. We're building something more important first. Trust, friendship, mutual respect. The kind of foundation that can support whatever comes next, whether that's romance or just really solid co-parenting." Daniel set down his own book. "Can I ask you something I've been wondering about?" "Always." "Do you regret the way this started? Do you wish we'd met differently, that we could have had a conventional relationship instead of this complicated arrangement?" Catherine considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Sometimes I wish I'd met you at a conference or a charity event, that we'd had normal dates and a normal courtship before deciding to have a child together. But then I remember that I probably wouldn't have noticed you at a conference. You would have been invisible to me the way service workers are usually invisible to people like me. It took extreme circumstances, me being desperate enough to pursue an unconventional arrangement, you being desperate enough to agree, for us to really see each other. So no, I don't regret how we started. I regret the dishonesty and the power imbalance, but not the fact that it happened." "That's remarkably honest," Daniel said. "I'm trying to make up for the dishonesty at the beginning by being aggressively honest now," Catherine replied with a slight smile. "It's exhausting, by the way. I don't recommend it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each returning to their books but aware of the other's presence in a way that felt companionable rather than awkward. This was what they were building, not a grand romance or a perfect partnership, but something more sustainable. A relationship based on choice rather than contract, on honesty rather than carefully managed expectations. The pregnancy progressed. Catherine's body changed, her belly growing round and obvious, her whole presence shifting as the reality of impending motherhood settled over her. Daniel went with her to every appointment, watched every ultrasound, heard every heartbeat that confirmed their child was growing healthy and strong. They found out at 20 weeks that they were having a daughter, and both of them cried in the examination room while the technician smiled and discreetly left them alone with their emotions. A daughter. Daniel was going to have a daughter. The reality of it was overwhelming in ways he hadn't anticipated, not just the responsibility of raising a child, but specifically raising a girl, teaching her about the world and keeping her safe and helping her become whoever she wanted to be. They converted one of the unused rooms into a nursery, spending weeks debating color schemes and furniture and the countless details that went into preparing for a baby. Daniel insisted on doing much of the physical work himself, assembling the crib, painting the walls, installing bookshelves for the children's books Catherine had started collecting with alarming enthusiasm. "You don't have to do all this," Catherine said, watching him struggle with crib assembly instructions one afternoon. "We can hire people." "I know," but I want to. I want to build something for her with my own hands, something that's mine to give, even if everything else in this house is yours." Catherine knelt beside him on the nursery floor, taking one end of a wooden rail he was trying to attach. "It's not all mine anymore. This house, this life, this child. We're building it together. That means it belongs to both of us." As Catherine's due date approached, Daniel found himself alternating between excitement and terror. He'd read every parenting book Dr. Winters recommended, attended birthing classes with Catherine where they were usually the only couple who wasn't actually married, and tried to prepare himself mentally for the reality of becoming a father. But nothing could fully prepare him for the night Catherine's water broke at 2 a.m, or the rush to the hospital, or the long hours of labor that followed. He stayed by her side through all of it, holding her hand through contractions, helping her breathe through the pain, offering what comfort and encouragement he could despite having no real idea what he was doing. And when their daughter finally entered the world at 6:43 in the morning, small and perfect and screaming with outrage at being forced from her comfortable darkness into bright lights and cold air, Daniel felt something fundamental shift in his chest. This was his daughter, his child. Not a biological obligation or contractual agreement, but a living, breathing human being he'd helped create and would spend the rest of his life trying to protect and guide and love. Catherine looked up at him from the hospital bed, exhausted and radiant, cradling their daughter against her chest. "Do you want to hold her?" Daniel took the tiny bundle carefully, terrified of doing something wrong, and looked down into his daughter's face. She'd stopped crying, her eyes attempting to focus on this new person holding her, her tiny hand wrapping around his finger with surprising strength. "Hi," he whispered. "I'm your dad, and I'm going to try really hard not to screw this up." "We both are," Catherine said softly. "Together." They named her Sarah, after Catherine's mother. Sarah Okoro Hale, a name that honored both sides of her heritage and both parents who'd chosen to be present, despite how unusual their situation was. The paperwork listed both their names, equal parents with equal rights. The contract that had tried to erase Daniel's existence now rendered irrelevant by mutual agreement and legal amendments Jennifer had worked tirelessly to secure. The first few months were chaos. Neither of them had any idea what they were doing, and Sarah had opinions about everything: when she wanted to eat, when she wanted to sleep, when she wanted to be held, and when she wanted space. Daniel and Catherine took turns with night feedings and diaper changes, supported each other through exhaustion and frustration and the overwhelming love that came with caring for this tiny human who depended on them completely. Catherine took maternity leave from the company, surprising everyone who knew her by prioritizing motherhood over corporate demands. Daniel enrolled in community college, starting the education he'd abandoned years ago when his father died, studying business administration because he'd realized that understanding Catherine's world would help him be a better partner in raising their daughter. They still hadn't defined their relationship beyond co-parents. Some nights, after Sarah was asleep and they were sitting together reviewing the chaos of the day, Daniel would look at Catherine and feel something that was definitely more than friendship, but not quite ready to be called love. Other times he'd catch her watching him feed Sarah or change her diaper, and he'd see in her expression something that suggested she felt the same complicated mix of feelings. But they didn't rush it. They'd learned through painful experience that rushing important decisions led to complicated consequences. So they focused on Sarah, on building the best possible foundation for her life, on learning to be parents together before trying to figure out if they could be partners in other ways. Marcus visited frequently, completely enamored with his niece, declaring himself the best uncle in the world, and spending hours just holding her while she slept. Daniel's mother flew over for 3 weeks, instantly bonding with Catherine in that way mothers do when they recognize another woman genuinely trying her best. She didn't ask too many questions about how Daniel and Catherine had ended up as co-parents, seeming to sense that the full story was too complicated for easy explanation. On Sarah's first birthday, they threw a small party in the house that had become home for all of them. Marcus was there with a girlfriend he'd recently started dating. Dr. Winters came with her husband. Jennifer Marsh even stopped by, amazed that the arrangement she'd thought would end in disaster had somehow transformed into something functional. After everyone left and Sarah was asleep in her crib, Daniel and Catherine sat together in the library that had been the site of so many important conversations over the past year and a half. "We did it," Catherine said, leaning her head against his shoulder in a gesture that had become natural through months of shared exhaustion and shared joy. "We actually managed to make this work." "We did," Daniel agreed, his arm coming around her shoulders automatically. "It's not perfect, and we've probably traumatized Jennifer with how many times we've had to modify the legal agreements. But we did it." "I've been thinking," Catherine said, "about us, about what we are, and what we might become." Daniel's heart rate accelerated. "Yeah? I think I'm ready to try. Not just co-parenting, not just friendship, but actually being together in a real way. If you want that. No pressure if you don't. We're doing fine as we are, but I wanted you to know that I'm ready if you are." Daniel turned to look at her, seeing in her face the same vulnerability he'd seen that first night in her office when she'd made him an impossible offer. But this offer was different, not based on desperation or dishonesty, but on months of building trust and learning to be honest about what they both wanted. "I'm ready too," he said. "Scared, definitely, but ready." She smiled, that genuine smile he'd learned to recognize as her real happiness instead of her professional mask. "Good. Because I've spent the last year falling in love with you, Daniel Okoro, and I was hoping you might feel the same way." "I do," he said, and kissed her for the first time since those 3 nights in the neutral room that felt like they'd happened in a different lifetime. It was gentle, tentative, full of promise for the future they were choosing to build together, instead of following a contract that had tried to keep them apart. They sat together in the library as night deepened outside, talking about the future in a way they'd never allowed themselves before. About maybe getting married someday. About maybe having more children. About continuing to build a life that honored both their unusual beginning and their genuine love for each other and for Sarah. Upstairs, their daughter slept peacefully, unaware that her parents' story was more complicated than most, but also more honest, more hard-won, more deliberately chosen. She would grow up knowing both parents loved her, that they'd fought for the right to be in her life, that family could be built through unconventional means as long as it was built with honesty and commitment. Years later, when Sarah was old enough to ask questions about how her parents met, they would tell her a version of the truth, that they'd met through unusual circumstances, that they'd had to figure out how to be family in unconventional ways, but that every choice they'd made was driven by love for her and for each other. The full details could wait until she was older, until she could understand the complexity of desperation and choice, of contracts and the human connections that transcended them. But for now, on this night when their daughter was 1 year old and they'd finally admitted their feelings for each other, Daniel and Catherine sat in the library and let themselves be simply grateful for the child they'd created, for the love they'd found in the most unlikely circumstances, for the future they were choosing to build together despite every reason it shouldn't have worked. Daniel thought about the man he'd been 2 years ago, scrubbing floors in this building, desperate and invisible, and convinced that survival required sacrificing pieces of himself he'd never get back. That man couldn't have imagined this outcome, sitting in a billionaire's library, holding her hand, planning a future with the daughter they'd created and the love they'd built from the ruins of a transactional arrangement. Life was strange that way. Sometimes the worst choices led to the best outcomes, not because the choices themselves were justified, but because humans were capable of taking broken situations and building something beautiful from the fragments. Daniel and Catherine had taken an arrangement that should have been purely transactional, should have left both of them empty and disconnected, and transformed it into something real. It wasn't perfect. They still had to navigate the power imbalance between their backgrounds, still had to figure out how to raise a daughter who would grow up with privileges Daniel never imagined, but would also need to understand the value of those privileges. They still had difficult conversations ahead about what to tell Sarah about her origins, about how to handle the judgment that would come when people learned the truth about how they'd started. But they would face those challenges together, as partners instead of parties to a contract, as parents united in their commitment to giving Sarah the best possible life, as two people who'd chosen each other despite every reason they shouldn't have worked. In the end, that was what mattered, not how they'd started, but what they'd built from that strange beginning. A family, unconventional and hard-won, but real in all the ways that counted. And as Daniel sat in the library holding Catherine's hand while their daughter slept upstairs, he finally understood what his father had tried to teach him about choices and consequences, and the difference between surviving and living. He'd thought agreeing to Catherine's arrangement was about survival, about doing whatever it took to keep Marcus safe and build a stable life. But it had turned out to be about living, about taking a risk that terrified him, and discovering that sometimes the most important things in life came from the choices you made when desperate, when scared, when absolutely certain you were making a mistake. They'd both made mistakes along the way. Catherine's dishonesty about her feelings, Daniel's initial willingness to treat fatherhood as a transaction, the countless moments when they'd chosen control over vulnerability or fear over honesty. But they'd also made the choice to keep trying, to keep being honest even when it was hard, to keep building something better than what the contract had outlined. And that choice, the choice to keep trying, to keep being present, to keep choosing each other and their daughter every single day, that was what transformed a transaction into a family, a contract into a commitment, desperation into love. The library's clock chimed midnight, marking the end of Sarah's first birthday and the beginning of whatever came next. Daniel and Catherine sat together in comfortable silence, no longer needing words to communicate what they'd learned through months of navigating the impossible together. They would face the future as they'd learned to face everything, together, honestly, with love for their daughter guiding every decision. It wouldn't always be easy, but it would be real, and chosen, and theirs. And that was enough.